Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The doorbell's shrill cry cut through the October afternoon like a blade through silk. I knew who it was before I opened the door, the same way you know when thunder is coming. That electric charge that makes your skin crawl and your teeth ache. 23 years had passed since I'd last seen him, but when I pulled the door open, those same wild eyes stared back at me, only now they carried shadows that hadn't been there when we were kids building forts in my backyard. "Hey man." His voice was rougher now, weathered by years I couldn't begin to imagine. "Thanks for letting me crash here." I stepped aside, letting him drag his battered duffel bag across my threshold. The house seemed to exhale as he entered, as if it had been holding its breath. He looked around my living room with the careful attention of someone cataloging escape routes, his fingers drumming against his thigh in a rhythm I couldn't follow. "Make yourself at home," I said, though something in my chest tightened as I spoke the words. "Guest room's upstairs, second door on the left." He nodded but didn't move toward the stairs. Instead, he stood perfectly still in the center of my living room, his head tilted slightly to one side like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. The afternoon light streaming through my windows seemed to bend around him, creating strange shadows that moved independently of his body. "You still have all these mirrors," he said, and there was something in his voice. Not quite surprise, not quite disappointment. Something hungrier. I followed his gaze around the room. I'd never really noticed how many mirrors I had until he pointed it out. The large one above the fireplace, the antique one by the staircase, the smaller decorative ones scattered across the walls. My ex-wife had been obsessed with mirrors, said they made spaces feel larger, brighter. After she left, I'd simply never bothered to take them down. "Yeah, well," I said, feeling oddly defensive. "They came with the house." He was already walking toward the antique mirror by the stairs, his reflection appearing in its silvered surface like a figure emerging from deep water. But something was wrong with it. The reflection moved a fraction of a second too late, as if it were trying to catch up with his actual movements. I blinked, certain I was imagining things, but when I looked again, his reflection was perfectly synchronized. "Beautiful piece," he murmured, running his fingers along the ornate frame. 18th century? I have no idea. "Listen, are you hungry? I could order some." "Do you ever feel like you're being watched?" he interrupted, still staring into the mirror. "Like there's something just outside your peripheral vision, waiting?" The question hit me like cold water. I had been feeling exactly that for months now, ever since my divorce finalized and the house became truly mine. Little things at first. The sense that someone had just left a room when I entered it. The feeling of eyes on my back when I was alone. Shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Sometimes," I admitted. He turned from the mirror then, and for a moment, I could have sworn his reflection continued staring into the glass for a heartbeat longer than it should have. "That's them," he said matter-of-factly. "They follow me everywhere now." A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a laugh. "Who follows you?" "The Watchers, the ones who live in the spaces between. They've been with me since I stopped taking the medication." He said it so casually, like he was discussing the weather. "My doctor says they're hallucinations, manifestations of my condition. But you see them too, don't you? In your peripheral vision?" I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things, that he needed to get back on his medication. But the words stuck in my throat because I did see them. Shadows that shouldn't exist, movements in mirrors when no one was there to cast a reflection, the constant feeling of being observed by invisible eyes. That first night, I made us dinner and we talked about safer things. Our childhood, mutual friends, his artwork. He was talented, had shown in galleries in New York and Los Angeles, but his work had become increasingly abstract, increasingly dark. He showed me photos on his phone, canvases covered in swirling blacks and grays, with eyes hidden in the patterns. So many eyes, watching from every brushstroke. "They inspire me," he explained when he saw my expression. "The watchers. They show me things in the mirrors, shapes and forms that don't exist in our world." I went to bed that night with his words echoing in my head, but sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was standing at the foot of my bed, just outside my vision. Twice I sat up and turned on the light, but the room was always empty. The mirror on my dresser reflected nothing but my own anxious face and the familiar shadows of my bedroom. The next morning, I found him standing in front of the bathroom mirror, perfectly still, his eyes wide and unblinking. He'd been there so long that steam from his shower had completely dissipated, leaving the mirror crystal clear. "How long have you been standing there?" I asked. "It's getting closer," he whispered without turning around. "Every time I refuse the pills, it gets a little closer." I looked in the mirror over his shoulder, and for a terrifying moment I saw 3 reflections instead of 2. His, mine, and something else. Something dark and indistinct standing between us. But when I blinked, there were only 2 reflections again, perfectly normal. "You need to take your medication," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were so deep and hollow that I took an involuntary step backward. "The medication makes them go away, but it makes everything else go away too. The art, the inspiration, the ability to see beyond the veil. Without them, I'm just empty." Days blended into nights, and my carefully ordered life began to unravel. I would catch glimpses of movement in mirrors throughout the house. Quick, darting shadows that vanished the moment I looked directly at them. The sensation of being watched intensified until it felt like a physical weight pressing against my shoulders. I started avoiding certain rooms, especially the guest bathroom where he spent hours staring into the mirror. My sleep became fractured, punctuated by dreams where I walked through my house and every mirror showed a different version of myself. Versions with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. Versions that moved independently of my body. Versions that reached toward the glass as if trying to push through into my world. One night, I woke to the sound of whispering. Soft, sibilant voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I followed the sound downstairs and found him sitting cross-legged on my living room floor, surrounded by candles, staring into the large mirror above the fireplace. "What are you doing?" I asked. "They're trying to tell me something," he said without looking away from the mirror. "About you. About this house. About why they followed me here." I looked into the mirror, and this time there was no mistaking what I saw. Behind our reflections, barely visible in the candlelight, stood a figure that shouldn't exist. It was tall and impossibly thin, with fingers that stretched like shadows across the reflected room. Its face was a void where features should have been, but I could feel it watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Do you see it?" he asked. "I see it," I whispered. "It's been waiting for you. They all have. This house, these mirrors, their doorways, and you've been keeping them open." The figure in the mirror raised one elongated hand and pressed it against the glass from the other side. The surface rippled like water, and I heard a sound like breaking ice, like reality tearing at the seams. "The medication," I said urgently. "Where are your pills?" "Upstairs in my bag, but if I take them now." He finally looked away from the mirror, and in that moment, the figure pressed harder against the glass. Cracks appeared in the silvered surface, spider-webbing outward from where its hand touched. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could almost make out words in a language that predated human speech. We ran upstairs together, and I watched him swallow 3 small white pills with shaking hands. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then, gradually, the whispers faded. The feeling of being watched lifted like fog burning off in morning sunlight. When we went back downstairs, the mirror was intact, showing only our own pale, frightened faces. "They're gone," he said, and there was such profound sadness in his voice that my chest ached. "For now," I agreed. But as I said it, I caught my own reflection in the antique mirror by the stairs. and for just a moment, so brief I might have imagined it, my reflection smiled, while my face remained perfectly still. He left 3 days later, back to his doctors and his treatment and his empty medicated existence. The house felt normal again, quiet and peaceful, just the way I liked it. The shadows behaved themselves, staying where shadows belonged. The mirrors showed only what they were supposed to show. Except sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I catch glimpses of movement that shouldn't be there. Sometimes, when I'm not paying attention, I see figures in the mirrors that vanish the moment I look directly at them. And sometimes, late at night when the house is perfectly still, I hear whispers coming from the walls. I've started to understand what he meant about the medication. The watchers don't just follow him. They follow anyone who has seen them, anyone who has acknowledged their existence. And now that I know they're there, now that I've seen them in all their impossible darkness, they will never truly leave me alone. The question that keeps me awake at night isn't whether they're real or just hallucinations brought on by stress and isolation. The question is whether it matters. Because real or not, they're changing me. I find myself standing in front of mirrors for longer and longer periods, searching the reflected depths for signs of movement. I've started avoiding the medication aisle at the pharmacy, afraid of what I might do if I found the right pills. And sometimes, when the light hits the mirrors just right, I see myself from angles that shouldn't exist, watch my reflection move independently of my body, observe my own face wearing expressions I never made. The watchers are patient. They've waited this long. They can wait a little longer. But every day they get a little closer to the glass, a little closer to breaking through. And every day I understand a little more clearly that the choice my friend faced, between medicated emptiness and terrifying awareness, is becoming my choice too. Last night I caught my reflection waving at me, a small gesture, barely noticeable, but my hand never moved from my side. Tonight I'm going to wave back. Story 2. The mountain air in Colorado carries more than altitude sickness. It carries secrets that seep into your lungs like smoke from dying campfires. I should have known something was wrong the moment I stepped into the psychological support tent at Resonance Festival, but hinges of perception don't always creak when they're about to break. The festival stretched across the alpine meadow like a temporary city of canvas and dreams, 30,000 souls seeking transcendence through music, substances, and each other. I'd volunteered for the crisis intervention tent because I thought I understood human nature. 3 years of psychology graduate school had given me that particular brand of academic arrogance. What I didn't understand was how thin the membrane becomes between observer and observed when reality starts to warp at the edges. The tent itself was a study in contrasts. Sterile white canvas walls meant to inspire calm, but the interior felt heavy, oppressive, like being inside a lung that couldn't quite expand. Folding chairs arranged in careful circles, bottled water stacked in pyramids, and crystals, so many crystals scattered throughout the space that the afternoon light fractured into prismatic warnings across every surface. My first real case walked in during the second day, when the festival's pharmaceutical experiments were beginning to show their casualties. The man moved with the deliberate care of someone fighting invisible restraints, his jaw locked in a perpetual clench that made his words come out slightly slurred, as if he were speaking through gritted teeth, even when his mouth was open. He asked for holy water the first time, not blessed water, not spiritual cleansing, holy water specifically, with the desperation of someone who'd already tried everything else. His eyes darted constantly to the corners of the tent, tracking movement that wasn't there, or movement I couldn't see. When I explained we only had regular bottled water, he accepted it with trembling hands, but wouldn't drink until I'd touched the plastic bottle first. The festival continued its rhythm around us, distant bass lines that seemed to emanate from underground, the constant migration of festival goers seeking their next experience. But inside our white sanctuary, something else was establishing its pattern. The man returned every few hours, always asking for the same thing, always disappointed by my answer, always leaving with that backward glance toward corners that held nothing but shadows. It was on his fourth visit that I noticed the crystals. The festival organizers had scattered them throughout the support spaces. Amethyst for calm, rose quartz for emotional healing, clear quartz for clarity of thought. Standard New Age decoration that I dismissed as harmless placebo decoration. But when the jaw-locked man stepped on a piece of clear quartz near the entrance, I heard it crack. Not just crack, fracture with the sharp report of ice breaking on a frozen lake. I bent to examine the stone after he left. The break was clean, surgical, as if something had pushed outward from the crystal's core with precise force. The remaining fragments still sparkled in the afternoon light, but there was something different about their refraction now. Something that made my eyes water when I looked too directly. Over the next 12 hours, it happened again and again. Each time the man entered the tent, another crystal would split. Not always immediately. Sometimes the fracture would come minutes after he'd left. A delayed snap that made everyone in the tent flinch and look around for the source. The volunteers began to whisper among themselves, attributing it to altitude changes or temperature fluctuations. But I was mapping the pattern now, counting the breaks, timing them against his visits. The man himself seemed unaware of the destruction following in his wake. His requests became more urgent with each appearance, his rigid jaw working as if he were chewing words before spitting them out. He spoke about something following him, something that had been tracking him since he'd arrived at the festival. When pressed for details, he would only say that it lived in the spaces between spaces, feeding on fractures and growing stronger with each break. By the third night, I'd begun to feel it too. The sensation started as a subtle wrongness, like wearing shoes on the wrong feet or hearing music played backward. The tent's atmosphere grew heavier with each crystal that broke, the air itself seeming to thicken until breathing required conscious effort. Other volunteers complained of headaches, of feeling watched, of dreams that felt more real than their waking hours. I found myself checking the corners of the tent compulsively, following the man's gaze toward empty spaces that somehow felt occupied. The rational part of my mind cataloged symptoms: stress, sleep deprivation, contact hallucination from working with someone clearly experiencing psychosis. But rationality becomes a thin shield when the evidence keeps mounting that something is fundamentally wrong with the world around you. The breakthrough came during the festival's final night, when the man arrived just as dawn was breaking over the mountains. His jaw had locked completely now. He communicated through desperate gestures and written notes on napkins. The note he handed me was barely legible, written in letters that shook with either palsy or terror. "It's almost through. The cracks are getting bigger." I looked around the tent at the scattered crystal fragments, dozens of them now, each break creating hairline fractures that seemed to extend beyond the stones themselves into the fabric of the tent, into the ground beneath, into reality itself. The early morning light caught these fractures and threw them into sharp relief, creating a web of damage that spread outward from wherever the man had walked. That's when I understood what he'd been trying to tell me. The crystals weren't breaking because of temperature or pressure or coincidence. They were breaking because something underneath was pushing up, using the stones as a conduit, growing stronger with each fracture. The festival ground itself was compromised, cracked like an eggshell with something waiting beneath for enough damage to accumulate. I tried to convince the other volunteers to evacuate the tent, but how do you explain that the ground beneath a mental health crisis station has become unreliable? How do you document that a man with a locked jaw is somehow channeling subterranean forces through decorative crystals? The incident reports I filed that morning read like the ravings of someone who'd spent too much time breathing mountain air and festival chemicals. The man left for the final time, just as the sun cleared the ridgeline. He pressed one last note into my palm before walking away with that careful, deliberate gait. The paper was warm, almost fever-hot, and the writing was different, clearer, as if whatever had been constraining his communication had finally released its grip. "Thank you for trying to help. It's awake now. It was never after me. I was just the key." I watched him disappear into the crowd of festival goers beginning their exodus back to the default world. The morning light revealed the full extent of the crystal damage throughout the tent. Hundreds of fractures creating an intricate pattern across the floor like a map of underground rivers or neural pathways. The cleanup crew arrived within hours, sweeping up the broken stones and rolling up the tent walls. They worked with efficient indifference, treating the crystal fragments as nothing more than festival debris. But I noticed that several of them kept glancing at the ground nervously, as if they could feel something moving beneath their feet. The official reports listed the broken crystals as festival wear and tear, and the man with the locked jaw never appeared in any of the support tent documentation. According to the volunteer coordinator, no one matching his description had been logged into our system during the entire 4-day event. I've returned to graduate school, back to my neat theories about human psychology and rational explanations for irrational behavior. My professors are pleased with my thesis on crowd psychology and mass hysteria at large gatherings. The incident reports from the festival support tent have become useful case studies in suggestion and groupthink. But sometimes, late at night, when the dormitory is quiet and I'm reviewing research on crystalline structures and geological instability, I feel that familiar heaviness in the air, the sensation of being watched from corners that hold nothing but shadows, the subtle wrongness that suggests reality has hairline fractures running through it, invisible until something underneath decides to push. And when I walk across campus, I've started avoiding the decorative rock gardens and crystal displays in the student center, because sometimes when the light hits them just right, I can see the stress patterns forming, tiny fractures that speak of pressure building beneath, waiting for the right frequency to shatter everything above. The festival ended 6 months ago, but I'm beginning to understand that some events don't have endings. They have intermissions. The man with the locked jaw was never the problem. He was just the tuning fork that helped something else find its resonant frequency. Now every campus feels like a festival ground, every building like a tent pitched over uncertain earth. The crystals in gift shops and meditation centers call to me with their perfect clarity, and I wonder how many tiny fractures are accumulating in the foundations of our consensus reality. I've stopped trying to find the man from the tent. Instead, I listen for the sound of things breaking underground, and I practice explaining to myself how stress and sleep deprivation can create elaborate, shared delusions. The explanations feel thinner each day, like excuses written on tissue paper. Sometimes I wake from dreams of something vast and patient, testing the boundaries of its crystalline prison with the methodical persistence of water finding cracks in stone. And sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I can hear my own jaw beginning to lock. Story 3. The first time I heard the scratching, I thought it was rats. 23 years I'd been operating the carousel at Wonderland Park, and I'd heard every sound those old mechanisms could make. The wheeze of hydraulics, the groan of worn bearings, the musical discord when the calliope skipped a note. But this was different. This came from the lamppost near the loading platform, a metallic scraping that seemed to pulse with desperate rhythm. I should have reported it to maintenance that Tuesday evening, but the park was hemorrhaging money, and I'd learned not to mention problems unless they posed immediate danger. The scratching was subtle, almost masked by the carousel's ambient noise. Only during the brief pauses between rides, when the last painted horse settled into stillness, could I detect that frantic clawing from within the post's hollow interior. The incident happened on Thursday. I was running the evening shift, watching families queue for what would be the final ride before closing. The autumn air carried that particular chill that made parents bundle their children tighter, made shadows stretch longer across the worn asphalt. The lamppost cast its pool of yellow light over the waiting area, and I was adjusting the safety barriers when I noticed them. The couple stood at the edge of the light's reach, their faces obscured by the brim of baseball caps pulled low. Between them, a small figure in a red jacket shifted restlessly. I couldn't make out details. The child seemed to blur at the edges, like a photograph taken with an unsteady hand. They approached the post with practiced efficiency, and I watched with growing unease as the man produced something metallic from his pocket. The action was so casual, so normalized, that for a moment my brain refused to process what I was seeing. The woman engaged me in conversation about ride times while the man worked behind the post. When she asked about the carousel's history, I found myself explaining the mechanics of the 1924 Denzel horses, my voice operating on autopilot, while my peripheral vision tracked movement I couldn't quite comprehend. The conversation lasted perhaps 3 minutes. When they departed for the ride, I assumed the small figure had gone with them, lost in the cluster of families boarding the platform. It wasn't until the carousel began its rotation that I noticed the padlock. It hung from a chain wrapped around the lamppost's base, the metal gleaming dully under the electric light. The lock appeared substantial, commercial grade, the kind used for securing storage units or industrial gates. But what made my skin crawl was its position. The mechanism faced inward, toward the post's hollow interior, as if it had been locked from the inside. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maintenance might have secured some internal wiring. The lock could have been there for weeks without my noticing. But even as I rationalized, that scratching sound seemed to intensify, becoming more urgent, more rhythmic. It reminded me of Morse code, though I couldn't decipher any pattern. The carousel completed its circuit. Families disembarked, children chattering about their favorite horses, parents checking watches and calculating bedtimes. I scanned the crowd for the couple in baseball caps, but they had vanished into the night's anonymity. The park was closing, and my shift was ending, but I couldn't shake the compulsion to examine the post more closely. Under the harsh glare of my flashlight, the lamppost revealed nothing unusual. Standard municipal fixture, probably installed in the 80s, with access panels for electrical work. The chain was newer, its links bearing no rust or wear. The padlock, when I knelt to examine it, was warm to the touch despite the cool evening air. The scratching had stopped. I filed a maintenance request the next morning, describing the unusual lock and recommending an inspection. The response came back within hours. No record of any work orders for that fixture, no authorization for security measures in that location. The maintenance supervisor suggested someone might be using park property for personal storage, a minor infraction that would be addressed during routine patrol. But when I arrived for my Friday shift, the lock was gone. No trace of it remained. No scratches on the post's surface, no indentations in the chain links, no evidence that anything had ever been attached. The maintenance crew insisted they hadn't removed anything, and security footage from that section of the park showed nothing unusual. According to every official record, the incident had never occurred, except for the scratching. It had returned, fainter now, but unmistakably present. During the carousel's operation, it blended with the mechanical symphony, but in the quiet moments between rides, I could hear it clearly. 3 short scratches, 3 long ones, 3 short again. SOS, over and over with mechanical precision. I began arriving early for my shifts, studying the lamppost with obsessive attention. The surface appeared normal in daylight, paint slightly weathered, a few minor dents consistent with years of use. But as evening approached and the shadows lengthened, subtle changes became apparent. The post seemed to vibrate slightly, though no tremor registered in the surrounding concrete. The electrical hum took on a different quality, lower and more resonant. And sometimes, just at the edge of perception, I thought I could see condensation forming on the interior of the access panels, as if something inside was breathing. The park's atmosphere began to shift around me. Conversations between visitors seemed muffled, their voices carrying an echo that made no acoustic sense. Children who had been laughing moments before would fall silent when passing the lamppost, their eyes tracking something I couldn't see. Parents would unconsciously quicken their pace, herding their families toward the carousel with an urgency that suggested some primal recognition of danger. I started keeping a logbook, documenting every instance of the scratching, every behavioral anomaly I observed. The entries filled 3 notebooks in 2 weeks. October 15th, scratching pattern changed. Now includes long pauses, as if waiting for response. October 18th, family with twin boys approached post, then retreated without explanation. Mother appeared distressed. October 22nd, post surface warm to touch despite below freezing temperature. Access panel slightly ajar. October 25th, maintenance report filed. Crew found nothing unusual but recommended psychological evaluation for operator. The recommendation for psychological evaluation should have concerned me more than it did. Instead, I felt oddly relieved that someone else had noticed the wrongness, even if they attributed it to my mental state rather than environmental factors. The park's HR department scheduled me for a fitness for duty assessment, standard procedure when employee behavior raised questions about safety or competence. Dr. Reeves was a kind woman in her 50s who specialized in occupational psychology. Her office smelled of lavender and contained too many plants, an obvious attempt to create a calming environment. She asked about stress levels, sleep patterns, family relationships, financial pressures, all the standard inquiries designed to identify obvious triggers for behavioral changes. I told her about the scratching. She listened without judgment, occasionally making notes in a leather portfolio. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and regarded me thoughtfully. Her questions were gentle but probing. Had I considered that prolonged exposure to repetitive sounds might create auditory hallucinations? Was I familiar with the psychological phenomenon of pattern recognition and random stimuli? Did I understand how isolation and routine could affect perception? I answered honestly. Yes, I was aware of these possibilities. Yes, I had considered that my observations might be subjective. But I also knew what I had heard, what I had seen, what I had felt during those encounters with something that didn't belong in the ordinary world. Dr. Reeves recommended a 2-week leave of absence. Rest, she said. Distance from the source of stress. Time to gain perspective on the situation. The park management agreed, and a temporary operator was brought in to cover my shifts. I spent those 2 weeks researching the history of Wonderland Park. The library's microfiche archives contained decades of local newspaper coverage. Most of it was routine. Grand openings, seasonal events, minor accidents. But buried in the social pages and police blotters, I found disturbing patterns. Missing persons reports that never resulted in investigations. Families who visited the park and left incomplete. Children who were there one moment and gone the next, with no explanation beyond parental claims of confusion or miscommunication. The reports dated back to the park's opening in 1952, but they intensified after 1987, the year the current lighting system was installed, the year the lampposts were erected throughout the grounds. Each post was hollow, designed to house electrical conduits and junction boxes. Each post had access panels that could be opened from the outside. Each post was positioned in areas where families congregated, where children might be left momentarily unattended while parents focused on other activities. I found myself driving past the park during my leave, parking across the street to observe the evening operations. The temporary operator seemed competent enough, maintaining the ride schedule without apparent difficulty, but I noticed he avoided the area near the lamppost, positioning himself on the opposite side of the platform and keeping his interactions with visitors brief and professional. On my final night of leave, I watched a family approach the post. 2 adults, indistinguishable in their casual anonymity, with a small figure between them. They moved with the same practiced efficiency I remembered from 2 weeks earlier, and I felt my heart rate accelerate as I recognized the pattern. I called 911 from my cell phone, reporting suspicious activity at the park. The dispatcher was polite but skeptical. My description of the behavior sounded vague even to me. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, they found nothing unusual. The family had vanished, the temporary operator was completing his closing duties, and the lamppost stood silent under its pool of yellow light. But I had seen the lock. I returned to work the following Monday with a new understanding of my situation. The scratching resumed immediately, more insistent than before, and I realized that my absence had changed nothing. Whatever was trapped inside the post, whatever had been placed there through means I couldn't comprehend, remained imprisoned and desperate for acknowledgement. The park management monitored my performance closely during those first days back. I maintained professional behavior, operated the carousel efficiently, and kept my observations to myself. But I also began carrying tools, a bolt cutter, a crowbar, a high-powered flashlight. If the opportunity arose, if I witnessed another incident like the one that had started this nightmare, I intended to act. The opportunity came on Halloween night. The park was crowded with families in costume, children running between attractions with sugar-fueled energy, parents struggling to maintain supervision in the chaos. I was operating extended hours, running continuous cycles to accommodate the increased demand. The lamppost cast its light over a constantly shifting crowd, and I had to strain to identify individuals in the sea of masks and costumes. I spotted them during the 9 o'clock ride, two figures in dark clothing, moving against the flow of pedestrian traffic. Between them, a small shape that seemed to flicker in and out of visibility. They approached the post with familiar efficiency, and this time I was ready. I hit the emergency stop, bringing the carousel to an immediate halt amid protests from riders. Abandoning my station, I ran toward the lamppost with my bolt cutters in hand. The crowd parted around me, confused by my urgency, but instinctively recognizing authority in motion. The lock was already in place, facing inward, warm metal gleaming under the electric light. The chain was taut, professionally secured, and the padlock was the same commercial grade I remembered from before. But now I could hear more than scratching from inside the post. There were voices, muffled, desperate, layering over each other in a chorus of pleas that made my hands shake as I positioned the cutters. The metal parted with a sharp crack, and the lock fell to the asphalt. The chain unwound itself, links clattering against the post's surface, and then, in the sudden silence that followed, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Nothing. No scratching. No voices. No evidence that anything had ever been trapped inside. The post stood empty, its access panels secure, its interior containing only the standard electrical components visible through the wire mesh. The crowd that had gathered to watch my performance began to murmur with confusion, then embarrassment, then concern for my mental state. Security arrived within minutes, followed by management, followed by paramedics who insisted on checking my vital signs and asking about drug use or recent head trauma. The park closed early, and I was escorted from the premises with a suspension notice and a requirement for immediate psychological evaluation. I never returned to Wonderland Park. The psychological evaluation resulted in a disability determination, and I now receive monthly payments that allow me to live quietly in a small apartment across town. Dr. Reeves continues to see me weekly, and we discuss coping strategies for auditory hallucinations and the long-term effects of occupational stress. But sometimes, late at night when the city grows quiet, I can still hear the scratching. It comes from the walls, from the heating ducts, from the spaces between spaces where hollow things wait for someone to notice their distress. And I know that somewhere in Wonderland Park, the lamppost continues to emit its desperate signals, trying to communicate something that no one wants to hear. The scratching follows a pattern now. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS repeated endlessly, mechanically, like a recording stuck on loop. Sometimes I think about returning to the park, about finding a way to open those access panels and discover what really waits inside. But then I remember the warmth of that metal lock, the way it had secured itself from within. And I stay in my apartment with its thin walls and unreliable heating, because some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some doors are better left unopened, and some sounds are better left unheard, even when they follow you home and scratch at the edges of your sanity until you can no longer distinguish between memory and madness. The scratching continues. Story 4. The first time I noticed the paper, it crackled like autumn leaves between my fingers. Chemistry homework. Mine, apparently, though I couldn't remember writing it with such precise, almost mechanical handwriting. The edges were brittle, yellowed around the corners, as if decades had passed since I'd scribbled those equations. But I'd turned it in just yesterday. Professor Henderson had handed it back with that familiar grunt of approval, the red A glowing at the top like a small wound. I stuffed it into my backpack without much thought, just another assignment in the endless parade of senior year obligations. It wasn't until I got home that I really looked at it. The paper felt wrong. Not just old, ancient. When I held it up to the light, I could see watermarks that definitely weren't there before, faint geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The ink had a strange quality too, as if it had been applied layer by layer over centuries, building up a kind of textural depth that made my eyes water when I stared too long. I told myself it was stress. Senior year did things to your mind, made you see patterns where none existed. College applications had turned my brain into a hypervigilant machine, constantly scanning for threats, for failures, for signs that everything was falling apart. Maybe that explained why I'd started noticing things about him. The boy who sat 3 seats behind me in chemistry. I'd never learned his name. He'd transferred in sometime after winter break, sliding into our routine so seamlessly that it felt like he'd always been there. Thin, pale, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that obscured his eyes. He never spoke unless called upon, never raised his hand, never seemed to exist except in the peripheral vision where shadows gathered. But he'd been watching me. I was sure of it now. It started with small things. The sensation of eyes on the back of my neck during tests. A prickling awareness that made my skin crawl. I'd turn around casually, pretending to stretch or check the clock. But he'd always be looking down at his paper, pencil moving with that same mechanical precision I'd noticed in my own returned homework. Then came the assignments themselves. Chemistry worksheets that felt like they'd been stored in a basement for decades. English essays that came back with margins so fragile they flaked away when I touched them. History reports where the typed text seemed to fade even as I read it, becoming increasingly illegible, as if the ink was slowly being absorbed back into the paper itself. I began paying closer attention to our routines. Henderson always collected homework at the beginning of class, stacking the papers on his desk while he launched into the day's lesson. During lunch, the classroom emptied except for the occasional student who needed to make up a quiz or ask questions about upcoming assignments. I'd started spending more time there myself, partly to get ahead on work, partly because I'd noticed something. The pale boy from the back row was always there too. He'd slip in quietly while Henderson was at the chalkboard, moving with a fluidity that made him seem more like a shadow than a person. I'd watch from my corner table as he approached Henderson's desk, not to speak to the teacher, but to simply stand near the pile of papers. He never touched them, at least, not when I was looking directly at him. But whenever I glanced away for even a moment, when I focused on my own work or checked my phone, I'd look back to find the papers had shifted slightly, as if someone had rifled through them and rearranged them with obsessive care. The watching intensified. In the hallways between classes, I'd catch glimpses of him in my peripheral vision, always maintaining the same distance. Never quite close enough for direct confrontation, but near enough that I could feel his presence like a cold draft. During assemblies, he'd somehow end up seated where he could observe me without being obvious about it. In the library, he'd appear at a table just within my sight line, not reading, not studying, just sitting with his hands folded, staring at nothing. Or staring at me while pretending to stare at nothing. Sleep became elusive. When I did manage to drift off, my dreams took on a strange quality, as if they were being observed from the outside. I'd find myself dreaming about dreams, experiencing that peculiar recursive sensation of being aware that I was asleep, while simultaneously feeling watched by something that shouldn't have been able to access my unconscious mind. The dreams themselves weren't particularly unusual. Fragments of school anxiety, memories of childhood summers, the kind of random neural firing that everyone experienced. But they felt occupied, as if there was a presence in the theater of my sleeping mind, taking notes from the balcony. I started keeping a dream journal, partly out of curiosity, partly because my AP psychology teacher had mentioned it as a useful exercise for understanding the subconscious. Every morning I'd scribble down what I could remember, the texture of dream rain on my skin, conversations with faceless figures, long corridors that stretched infinitely in both directions. It was while reviewing these notes that I first noticed the pattern. The dreams I was recording seemed familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. Not familiar because I'd experienced them, but familiar because I'd read about them somewhere else. The specific details were too precise, too unusual to be coincidental. The way dreamlight fell across imaginary landscapes, the exact sequence of events and conversations that made no logical sense. I'd seen these described before, but I couldn't place where. The realization came during a particularly restless night. I'd given up on sleep around 2 a.m. and was sitting at my desk, reading through old homework assignments by the light of my desk lamp. That's when I saw it, wedged between 2 chemistry worksheets, a composition notebook I'd never seen before. The cover was unremarkable. Black and white speckled cardboard, the kind sold in bulk at the beginning of every school year. But when I opened it, my hands began to shake. Page after page of handwriting. My dreams, described in meticulous detail, but written in that same mechanical script I'd been noticing on my returned homework. Dreams I'd had last week were there, dreams from months ago, but also entries dated for nights that hadn't happened yet. Tomorrow night, next week, next month. The handwriting was steady, precise, completely unlike my own hurried scrawl. Each entry was formatted the same way: date, time, duration, followed by a narrative account that read like a clinical report. But the content was unmistakably mine: fears and anxieties and memories that no one else could have known. Most disturbing were the future entries. Dreams scheduled for the coming weeks, described in the same careful detail as those I'd already experienced. As if someone had planned them, scripted them, arranged them like scenes in a play. I flipped through the pages with growing horror, noting how the ink seemed fresh on some entries, still slightly wet to the touch despite being dated weeks or months in the past. The paper itself had that same aged quality I'd noticed in my homework: brittle, yellowed, as if it had been written decades ago and left to cure in some forgotten archive. And at the very back of the notebook, tucked between the last written page and the back cover, was a small slip of paper with tomorrow's date and a single line of text: "He will find the notebook tonight." My skin went cold. The handwriting was different here. Hurried, almost panicked, as if whoever had written it was running out of time. Below that, in the same frantic script, "The ink remembers everything." I closed the notebook and pushed it away from me, as if distance could somehow break whatever connection had formed between my sleeping mind and the pages. But even as I tried to convince myself this was some elaborate prank, some stress-induced hallucination, I could feel the truth settling into my bones like a winter chill. Someone had been inside my dreams. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally present in the space where my mind went when consciousness retreated. And they'd been documenting everything, collecting my nocturnal experiences like specimens in a jar. The next morning I watched him more carefully than ever. The pale boy from chemistry class, sitting in his usual spot 3 rows back, never quite looking at me directly but somehow always aware of my presence. When Henderson returned our latest assignments, I paid attention to the condition of my paper. Brittle, ancient, the ink slightly smeared as if it had been handled while still wet, then allowed to dry for far longer than should have been possible. I stayed after class, pretending to organize my backpack while Henderson erased the chalkboard. The pale boy lingered too, standing near the door but not leaving, his attention fixed on something I couldn't identify. When Henderson finally left the room, clicking off the lights and locking the door behind him, we were alone in the dim hallway. He turned to look at me directly for the first time all year. His eyes were darker than I'd expected, with an intensity that made me take an involuntary step backward. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost musical, with an accent I couldn't place. He said my dreams tasted like copper and starlight. He said the notebook was just the beginning, that my sleeping mind had been broadcasting signals he'd learned to receive and record. He said the aged paper was a side effect of temporal displacement, that bringing dream content into the waking world required borrowing time from somewhere else. Then he handed me another notebook, this one bound in leather so dark it seemed to absorb light. He said it contained dreams I hadn't had yet, experiences that wouldn't occur for months or years, if ever. He said time wasn't linear in the dream realm, that past and future existed simultaneously, accessible to anyone who knew how to navigate the spaces between consciousness and sleep. I took the notebook without fully understanding why. The leather was warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting in sunlight, though we were standing in the perpetual fluorescent twilight of the school hallway. When I opened it, the pages were blank, but I could smell ink, fresh and sharp, like the moment after lightning strikes. He told me the dreams would come whether I wanted them or not, that the connection had been established and couldn't be severed. He said I could choose to document them myself, or let him continue doing it for me. But either way, my sleeping mind now belonged to something larger than individual consciousness. Then he walked away, disappearing around the corner with that same fluid motion I'd noticed before, leaving me standing alone with 2 notebooks and the growing certainty that my nights would never again be entirely my own. I should have thrown the notebooks away, should have reported him to school administration, should have told my parents, should have done any number of things that might have restored some sense of normalcy to my life. Instead, I found myself reading. The leather-bound notebook contained dreams of impossible beauty and terrible longing, scenarios where I flew through cities that existed nowhere on Earth, conversations with people whose faces shifted like water, journeys through landscapes that followed dream logic rather than physics, but also darker content, dreams where I was perpetually lost, where familiar places became hostile and threatening, where everyone I'd ever known looked at me with the eyes of strangers. The dates were scattered across months and years. Some entries were marked for my 70s, dreams I presumably wouldn't have for decades. Others were scheduled for next week, and interspersed throughout were notes in that mechanical handwriting, observations about the quality of different dreams, rankings based on criteria I didn't understand. As the weeks passed, I began to recognize the dreams as they occurred. I'd fall asleep and find myself in scenarios I'd already read about, following scripts that had been written before I'd ever experienced them. The sensation was deeply disturbing. Not quite déjà vu, but something more invasive, as if my subconscious was being directed by an external intelligence. The pale boy, I still didn't know his name, continued to appear in my peripheral vision. In hallways, in the library, sometimes standing across the street from my house when I looked out my bedroom window late at night. Always watching, always maintaining that careful distance, never approaching me directly, but making his presence known. My returned homework continued to arrive in that aged, fragile condition. Now I understood it was more than just paper deterioration. It was evidence of temporal displacement, proof that my work was being processed through some mechanism that existed outside normal time. The ink would be fresh when I turned assignments in, but ancient when they came back, as if they'd spent decades in transit between submission and return. Sleep became a source of anxiety rather than rest. I'd lie awake for hours, dreading the moment when consciousness would slip away, and my mind would become accessible to whatever intelligence was collecting my dreams. When I did sleep, I'd experience the strange doubling sensation of being both participant and observer, aware that my experiences were being recorded even as I lived them. The notebooks multiplied. I'd wake up to find new ones on my desk, each containing different categories of dreams. Childhood memories reconstructed with adult understanding, anxiety, dreams about futures that might never occur, peaceful dreams that felt more like medications than natural sleep experiences, all documented in that same mechanical handwriting, all dated with impossible precision. I tried staying awake for entire nights, drinking coffee and energy drinks, keeping myself conscious through sheer force of will. But the dreams found me anyway. I'd nod off for minutes at a time and wake up to find new entries in the notebooks. Brief dreams compressed into seconds of sleep, but documented as if they'd lasted for hours. The worst part was the gradual realization that the dreams were changing me. The boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness was becoming permeable. I'd catch myself thinking in dream logic during the day, expecting impossible things to happen, responding to stimuli that existed only in my documented nocturnal experiences. And always, the pale boy watched from the edges of my vision, never interfering directly, but somehow orchestrating the entire experience. He'd smile sometimes when our eyes met in the hallway, an expression that suggested he knew things about me that I was only beginning to discover. The notebooks continued to accumulate, my room filled with them, stacked on my desk, lined up on shelves, tucked into drawers and closets. Each one contained hundreds of dreams, thousands of hours of sleeping experience, all cataloged and organized according to some system I couldn't decipher. And with each passing night, I became more certain that what was happening to me wasn't supernatural or psychological, but something else entirely. Something that existed in the spaces between categories, in the ambiguous territory where consciousness and external reality intersected. The question wasn't whether the dream thief was real. The question was whether I was still real, or if I'd become just another entry in his vast collection, Another set of experiences to be documented and filed away in notebooks that aged decades in the space between sleeping and waking. The ink was always fresh at dawn, still wet with the residue of dreams that might have been mine, or might have belonged to someone else entirely. And every morning I'd wake up to find new notebooks waiting, ready to collect whatever remained of my diminishing sense of self. The watching never stopped. The documentation never ended. And somewhere in the growing library of my recorded dreams, the boundary between observer and observed had become so blurred that I could no longer tell which side of the notebook I was on. Story 5. The first time the alarm screamed through the darkness, I thought it was a malfunction. 3:17 a.m. The shrill electronic wail cut through my sleep like a blade, dragging me from dreams of empty corridors into the suffocating reality of my apartment building's security system. As head of maintenance for the Meridian complex, these midnight interruptions came with the territory, but something about this particular alarm felt different. Wrong. I stumbled through my apartment, grabbing the tablet that controlled the building's security network. The motion sensors in the main hallway had triggered, motion sensors that hadn't given me a single false positive in the 18 months since installation. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled up the camera feeds, expecting to see the familiar outline of a raccoon, or perhaps a vagrant who'd somehow slipped past the lobby security. The screens showed nothing. 8 cameras covering every angle of the third-floor corridor displayed the same image. An empty hallway bathed in the cold blue glow of emergency lighting. No movement, no shadows. No explanation for why the sensors had detected a presence substantial enough to trigger the alarm system. I threw on clothes and took the elevator down from my 4th-floor unit, my heart hammering against my ribs with each floor that passed. The building felt different at this hour, more alive somehow, as if the darkness breathed through its walls. The familiar hum of the HVAC system seemed louder, more insistent, punctuated by the subtle creaks and sighs that all old buildings make when they think no one is listening. The elevator doors parted with their usual mechanical whisper, revealing the 3rd-floor hallway exactly as the cameras had shown it. Empty, silent. Nothing out of place except for the lingering scent of something I couldn't quite identify, metallic and cold, like morning frost on steel. I walked the length of the corridor, checking each door, each corner, each potential hiding spot. The carpet showed no signs of disturbance, no indication that anyone had passed through recently. But as I approached the section where the motion sensors had triggered, something made me stop. There, just visible in the pale emergency lighting, were footprints. Not wet footprints or mud tracks that might explain themselves away as maintenance residue. These prints were formed by what looked like fine, cold dust, the kind that settles in places that haven't been disturbed for years. Each print was perfectly formed, showing the outline of bare feet with distinct toe marks and heel impressions. They began at the elevator bank and proceeded down the hallway for exactly 12 steps before simply ending, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished into the air. I crouched beside the prints, my breath forming small clouds in air that had grown noticeably colder. The dust felt strange beneath my fingertips, not quite like any building material I'd encountered in my 15 years of maintenance work. It held its shape too well, as if each particle had been deliberately placed to form these impossible impressions. That's when I noticed the motion sensor panel blinking with an amber light I'd never seen before. The display, usually dark except during active monitoring, showed a single number pulsing slowly against the black screen. 07. 7. I stared at that number for several minutes, trying to remember if it corresponded to any error code in the system manual. But the longer I looked, the more certain I became that this wasn't part of any diagnostic routine. The number pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost organic, like a heartbeat visible in digital form. I documented everything with photos, though the camera seemed unable to capture the full detail of what I was seeing. The footprints appeared faded in the pictures, less distinct than they looked to my naked eye. The number on the sensor screen came out as a bright blur, unreadable. By morning, the footprints had vanished completely. The sensor panel showed its normal readings. No trace of the mysterious countdown. I might have convinced myself it had been a dream if not for the photos on my phone. evidence that something had definitely occurred, even if the images failed to capture its true nature. The next night, it happened again. 3:17 a.m., same alarm, same empty cameras. This time I was ready, throwing on my clothes and rushing to the elevator before the wailing had fully stopped. The third-floor hallway waited in its blue-lit silence, and once again I found the impossible footprints tracking across the carpet. But now the sensor panel displayed a different number. Arrow 6. 6. The countdown had advanced. I spent the rest of that night researching the building's history, diving into construction records and previous maintenance logs. The Meridian complex had been built in 1987 on the site of an old electronics warehouse. Nothing particularly sinister in its past. The motion sensor system had been installed during a recent renovation, all equipment certified and functioning within normal parameters. Yet every night, the pattern repeated. 3:17 a.m. brought the screaming alarm, the empty cameras, the dust-formed footprints, and the steadily decreasing number on the sensor display. Each night I tried different approaches, waiting in the hallway before the alarm, checking alternative routes into the building, even disabling the motion sensors entirely. Nothing changed the sequence of events. With each passing night, the experience grew more intense. The cold spot in the hallway became more pronounced, dropping the temperature by what felt like 20 degrees in a localized area around the footprints. The dust began to take on an almost luminous quality, glowing faintly in the emergency lighting as if charged with some internal energy. And I began to feel watched, not the casual observation of security cameras or the distant attention of sleeping neighbors. This was immediate, intimate scrutiny, the sensation of being examined by something that existed just beyond the edge of perception. During my daily rounds, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by the conviction that something stood at the foot of my bed, breathing in rhythm with my own exhales. The building's other residents began to complain about disturbances, strange sounds in the walls, fluctuations in their electrical systems, the persistent feeling that their apartments had been searched while they were away. Mrs. Chen from 3B mentioned that her thermostat kept resetting itself to impossibly low temperatures. The couple in 3D reported that their baby monitor picked up whispered conversations in an empty room. I assured them I was investigating, filing the complaints in a folder that grew thicker with each passing day. But I said nothing about the countdown, nothing about the footprints or the watching presence that seemed to grow stronger as the number decreased. The night the display showed 2, the footprints led not just down the hallway but to my own apartment door, 12 steps ending exactly at my threshold, as if whatever created them had stood there for some time, studying the barrier between the public corridor and my private space. The dust prints showed more detail now, individual toe prints with what looked like faint scratch marks, heel impressions deep enough to suggest significant weight. I changed my locks that morning, though I couldn't explain to myself what difference it might make against something that left footprints without feet. 1. The final night of the countdown brought changes I hadn't anticipated. The alarm sounded at 3:17 as always, but this time the entire building's electrical system fluctuated with each pulse. Lights dimmed and brightened in waves that seemed to flow from floor to floor. The elevator stopped functioning entirely, its display showing random numbers and letters in sequences that hurt to look at directly. The footprints in the hallway were no longer formed by dust. Instead, they appeared as impressions in the carpet itself, as if something impossibly heavy had pressed down hard enough to leave permanent marks in the industrial-grade flooring. The cold spot had expanded to encompass the entire corridor, turning my breath to visible vapor and making the metal fixtures crackle with frost. But it was the sensor panel that held my attention. Instead of showing 0 as I'd expected, the display had gone completely black. Not off. Black in a way that seemed to absorb light rather than simply lacking it. Staring into that darkness felt like looking into something that looked back, something that had been counting down to this moment with infinite patience. I found myself unable to move, standing in that frozen corridor as my watch ticked past 3:30, then 4 o'clock, then 5. The sensation of being observed had intensified to the point where I could feel the weight of attention like physical pressure against my skin. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to abandon the building and never return. but my feet remained planted on the carpet as if held by gravity that belonged to a different world. Dawn came slowly, natural light filtering through the corridor windows to mix with the artificial emergency glow. Only then did the pressure release, allowing me to stumble back to the elevator and escape to my apartment. I called in sick that day, spending the hours until sunset researching every aspect of the building I could access. What I found changed everything. Buried in the insurance records was a claim from 1987, filed just before construction began. The electronics warehouse that had previously occupied the site had suffered what investigators called unexplained equipment failures in its final months of operation. Computers had begun displaying countdown sequences with no programmed source. Temperature control systems had malfunctioned, creating freezing zones in specific areas of the building. Workers reported feeling watched, followed, examined by something they couldn't see. The warehouse had been demolished after a final incident in which every electronic device in the building had simultaneously displayed the same image. Footprints leading through empty corridors, counting down to something that never quite arrived. Or perhaps it had arrived and simply waited. As I write this, the sun is setting on what should be the first night after the countdown reached its end, but I know now that 0 wasn't the destination. It was the beginning. Whatever has been manifesting in the Meridian complex didn't need 7 nights to appear. It needed 7 nights to remember how to exist in a world that had tried to delete it. The motion sensors throughout the building are registering movement on every floor now, but the cameras show nothing. The temperature has dropped 20 degrees in every apartment, and the electrical systems are beginning their cascade failures again. Mrs. Chen knocked on my door an hour ago to ask if I'd heard the footsteps in her walls. The couple in 3D called to report that their baby monitor is now picking up breathing in every room of their apartment simultaneously. I can feel the weight of attention growing stronger as darkness falls. Not just watching now, but studying, learning, preparing to fully inhabit the space it has claimed through patience and repetition. The building itself seems to be adapting to accommodate something that doesn't quite fit within the normal parameters of existence. My watch shows 3:16 a.m. In 60 seconds, I'll discover what comes after the countdown ends. Whether the Meridian complex has been hosting a supernatural entity slowly manifesting through repetitive ritual, or whether I've been documenting my own descent into a very particular kind of madness that interprets ordinary building maintenance as cosmic horror. The distinction may be less important than I'd thought. The alarm is beginning to sound. Story 6. The fluorescent lights in the Pine Ridge Motor Lodge lobby hummed their familiar tune, a discordant symphony that had become the soundtrack to my existence. 3 months into this graveyard shift, and I'd learned to read the moods of this roadside purgatory by the pitch of those dying bulbs. Tonight, they seemed different. Agitated. The digital clock behind the reception desk read 11:47 p.m. when he walked in. I'd seen plenty of late arrivals during my tenure as night auditor, but this man commanded attention in a way that made my scalp prickle. Average height, unremarkable clothes, a brown jacket that had seen better decades, and scuffed leather shoes. What unsettled me wasn't his appearance, but the smile that never wavered from his lips. Not a grimace, not a smirk, but a genuine expression of contentment that remained perfectly fixed regardless of whether he was speaking, listening, or simply standing in silence. The man approached my station with measured steps that echoed oddly in the small lobby. Each footfall seemed to linger a fraction too long, as if the worn carpet was reluctant to release his weight. "Room for the night," he said, his voice pleasant and unremarkable. The smile never shifted. "Preferably something quiet. I have some collecting to catch up on." I processed his registration mechanically, noting that he paid in cash, crisp 20s that felt unusually cold against my fingertips. His signature flowed across the guest ledger in elaborate script that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. "Room 237, second floor, end of the hall. Will you be needing any additional services?" I asked, following the script I'd recited hundreds of times. That's when he leaned closer, and I caught a whiff of something musty and old. like dried flowers pressed between forgotten book pages. Actually, I have a small favor to ask. His smile stretched slightly wider, though I could have sworn the corners of his mouth hadn't moved. I travel with certain mementos, personal items that require special care. Would it be possible to store them in your office during my stay? I find that sometimes hotel rooms aren't quite secure enough for my more precious belongings. The request struck me as odd but not unprecedented. I'd stored everything from jewelry to documents for paranoid guests before. What harm could a few personal items cause? I suppose that would be acceptable, as long as they're not valuable enough to require a safe. Oh, they're valuable to me, he said, that perpetual smile now seeming to cast its own shadow across his features. But not in any way your insurance would recognize. Within 10 minutes, he returned with a worn leather satchel that clinked softly with each step. The bag seemed heavier than its size suggested, causing the man to walk with a slight list to one side. He placed it carefully on my desk, and I noticed his fingers lingered on the clasps longer than necessary. Just some old things, he explained, though I hadn't asked. Family heirlooms, you might say. Pieces of places I've been, fragments of moments I've collected over the years. I gestured toward the small storage cabinet behind my chair. They'll be perfectly safe there. As I lifted the satchel, a chill shot through my arms that had nothing to do with the lobby's aggressive air conditioning. The bag felt dense in a way that defied physics, as if it contained something far more substantial than mere objects. When I set it inside the cabinet, it settled with a soft thud that seemed to resonate through the floor. The man nodded his approval, that unwavering smile now appearing almost grateful. I'll retrieve them before checkout. Thank you for accommodating my eccentricities. He turned to leave, then paused at the foot of the stairs. Oh, and... He looked back over his shoulder, and for just a moment, I could have sworn his smile flickered. If you hear them calling, don't listen too closely. Some voices are better left unanswered. I dismissed his comment as the kind of cryptic rambling that insomnia and interstate travel could produce. But as his footsteps faded up the stairwell, I found myself staring at the closed cabinet door with an inexplicable sense of unease. The first hour passed normally. I caught up on paperwork, balanced the day's receipts, and made my routine security rounds. The hotel settled into its typical midnight stillness. That particular quiet found only in places where transient lives intersect briefly before dispersing back into the night. It was during my second round that I noticed something odd. The lobby's fluorescent lights had always cast harsh uniform shadows. Every object, chairs, tables, the artificial plants that somehow thrived under artificial light, threw predictable dark shapes across the carpet. But as I returned to my desk around 1:30 a.m., I realized that the shadows seemed different. More specifically, they seemed wrong. I stood perfectly still, studying the familiar geography of the lobby. The coffee table near the entrance cast its usual rectangular shadow. The magazine rack threw its expected angular silhouette. But there were other shadows now, shapes that didn't correspond to any visible objects. Thin, elongated shadows that stretched across the carpet like dark fingers. Circular shadows that pulsed almost imperceptibly, as if breathing. And stranger still, these shadows appeared to be moving. Not in the dramatic horror movie way that would have sent me running. Instead, they shifted with glacial subtlety, creeping across the worn carpet with the patience of geological time. A shadow that had been near the front desk slowly stretched toward the storage cabinet. Another dark shape, roughly human in proportion but impossibly thin, drifted from the seating area toward my position. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The shadows remained, but now they seemed closer. My first instinct was to blame exhaustion. 3 months of 12-hour night shifts had taken their toll, and I'd been experiencing minor hallucinations for weeks. Peripheral movements that vanished when I turned to look, sounds that had no source. Sleep deprivation was a well-documented demon, and I'd made peace with its minor torments. But these shadows felt different. They carried weight, presence, and as I watched, paralyzed by a combination of disbelief and fascination, I realized they were converging on the storage cabinet. The digital clock read 2:15 a.m. when I first heard my name. It started as a whisper so soft I mistook it for the building's ventilation system. But as the minutes crawled by, the sound resolved into something unmistakably vocal. A voice, or rather, multiple voices speaking in unison, calling from somewhere near my feet. I looked down and saw the shadows had reached the base of my desk. They pooled around my chair like spilled ink, and from their dark depths came that impossible whisper. Michael. My name, spoken by voices that sounded like autumn leaves scraping across concrete. The shadows beneath my feet pulsed with each syllable, and I felt a vibration through the soles of my shoes that seemed to travel up through my bones. I jerked my chair backward, but the shadows followed. They flowed across the carpet with liquid smoothness, maintaining their connection to the storage cabinet while simultaneously reaching toward me with tendrils of absolute darkness. Michael, come closer. The voices multiplied, creating a chorus of whispers that seemed to emanate from the carpet itself. Some voices sounded elderly, others youthful. A few carried accents I couldn't place, while others spoke with the flat neutrality of the American Midwest. But all of them knew my name, and all of them wanted something. I stood up so quickly that my chair rolled into the wall behind me. The shadows paused, as if considering this new development, then resumed their slow advance. They moved with purpose now, reaching across the lobby floor like dark rivers flowing toward an inevitable sea. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Gas leak causing hallucinations. Sleep deprivation manifesting in increasingly severe symptoms. Some kind of neurological episode triggered by stress and poor diet. Each theory felt reasonable, logical, and completely inadequate to explain the reality of what I was experiencing. The shadows had spread across most of the lobby now, creating a web of darkness that connected every piece of furniture to the storage cabinet behind my desk. And from this network of shadow came an endless whisper of voices, all calling my name, all beckoning me to come closer. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the floor. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing normal carpet underneath. But the moment I moved the light away, the darkness returned, deeper and more extensive than before. That's when I realized the shadows weren't being cast by anything in the lobby. They were emerging from the storage cabinet itself. The leather satchel the guest had left was somehow projecting shadows through the closed cabinet door, across the floor, and throughout the entire lobby. The impossible nature of this observation should have convinced me that I was experiencing a complete psychological break. Instead, it filled me with a crystalline certainty that something genuinely wrong was happening. I approached the cabinet with the same caution I might use when handling a venomous snake. The whispers grew louder as I drew near, resolving into distinct words and phrases. Let us out. We've been waiting. So lonely in the dark. Join us, Michael. Don't you remember us? That last voice stopped me cold. It sounded familiar. A woman's voice with a slight southern accent that tugged at memories I couldn't quite grasp. But before I could process this recognition, another voice joined the chorus, then another, until the whispers became a cacophony of pleading, demanding, cajoling voices. My hand hesitated over the cabinet handle. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to abandon my post, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was contained in that innocuous leather bag. But a deeper compulsion, part curiosity, part recognition, part something I couldn't name, drew me forward. The cabinet door opened with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the whisper-filled lobby. The satchel sat exactly where I'd placed it hours earlier, but now it seemed to pulse with its own internal light. Not visible light, but something darker. An anti-illumination that made the fluorescent bulbs overhead seem dim by comparison. The bag's leather surface writhed with shadows that had no relationship to any actual light source. As I watched, transfixed, the bag's clasps began to open by themselves. The whispers stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than any sound could have been. The shadows remained, covering the lobby floor in a network of impossible darkness, but the voices had ceased their eternal murmuring. In that silence, I could hear my own breathing, my heartbeat, and something else, a soft rustling from inside the satchel. I should have closed the cabinet. I should have walked away, called the police, quit my job, done anything except continue standing there as the bag opened like a flower blooming in reverse. But fascination held me motionless as the satchel revealed its contents. Objects. Dozens of small objects nestled in what looked like black silk. But these weren't the typical personal items one might expect a traveler to carry. Each object seemed to possess its own gravity, its own presence, as if it contained something far more significant than its physical form suggested. A child's toy soldier, painted in colors that hurt to look at directly. A woman's bracelet that gleamed with metallic light that wasn't quite gold, wasn't quite silver. A fountain pen that appeared to be writing invisible words in the air above it. A small mirror that reflected not my face but someone else's. Someone I didn't recognize but who seemed to be looking directly at me with pleading eyes. And from each object extended a shadow far more complex and extensive than physics should allow. These weren't simple silhouettes, but intricate networks of darkness that sprawled across the lobby like neural pathways in some vast, impossible brain. I reached toward the toy soldier, and the moment my fingertip made contact with its painted surface, the world exploded into sensation. Suddenly, I was somewhere else. A suburban living room decorated for Christmas, circa 1987. A boy, 8 years old, gap-toothed smile, dinosaur pajamas, played with an army of tiny soldiers while his parents argued in the kitchen. The argument escalated. A door slammed. The boy looked up with confused, frightened eyes as his father's car pulled out of the driveway for the last time. Then I was back in the lobby, gasping, my finger still touching the toy soldier. But now I understood. The object wasn't just a memento, it was a moment. A specific instance of human experience, crystallized and preserved like an insect in amber. The bracelet showed me a woman's wedding day, the moment she realized her husband-to-be was having second thoughts. The fountain pen revealed a novelist's despair as he destroyed his life's work, page by page. The mirror reflected a girl discovering that her father wasn't coming home from the war. Each object contained a fragment of human experience, but not the joyful or triumphant moments. These were the precise instances when hope transformed into loss, when certainty dissolved into doubt, when love curdled into abandonment. They were collection points for the exact moments when people realized their lives had changed forever, and not for the better. And I understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins, that I was looking at the guest's collection. His mementos weren't objects at all. They were captured moments of human suffering, preserved with the same care that a lepidopterist might pin butterflies to a display board. The voices returned, but now I could distinguish them. The boy whose father left. The bride whose wedding became a funeral for her dreams. The novelist who died unknown and unpublished. The girl who spent the rest of her life waiting for someone who would never return. They weren't calling to me randomly. They were calling because they recognized something in me. Some resonance, some compatibility that made me a suitable addition to the collection. I jerked my hand away from the toy soldier and stumbled backward. The shadows writhed more violently, reaching toward me with tendrils of concentrated darkness. The whispers became urgent, desperate. Don't leave us here. You understand now? You're like us. You belong with us. That last accusation hit me like a physical blow because somewhere in the depths of my soul, I recognized its truth. I was like them. Not in the specifics of my losses, but in the fundamental nature of my existence. I was a man whose life had been defined by a series of small disappointments, minor betrayals, gradual erosions of hope. I worked nights at a roadside hotel not because I enjoyed solitude, but because I'd given up on meaningful human connection. I was already partially collected, already preserved in my own amber of quiet desperation. The guest hadn't chosen me randomly. He'd recognized in me the same quality that had drawn him to every other moment in his collection. The precise instant when possibility collapsed into resignation. I slammed the cabinet door shut, but the shadows remained. They covered the lobby floor completely now, creating a dark sea broken only by islands of fluorescent light. And from that sea came the endless whispers of voices that had been calling my name long before I'd ever heard them. The clock read 4:23 a.m. when the guest returned. He descended the stairs with the same measured pace he'd used earlier, but now his perpetual smile seemed less fixed and more genuine. He approached my desk as if nothing unusual had occurred, as if the lobby wasn't swimming in impossible shadows that whispered my name. "I trust my belongings were secure?" he asked. I wanted to scream at him, to demand explanations, to ask what he'd done and why he'd chosen me. Instead, I heard myself responding in a voice that sounded remarkably calm. "They were perfectly safe." "Excellent." He reached past me to open the cabinet, and his hand brushed against my arm. The contact sent another wave of alien sensation through my nervous system. Not the specific memory visions I'd experienced with the objects, but something deeper. A sense of vast age, of patience measured in geological time, of appetites that transcended human understanding. He lifted the satchel with careful reverence, and I noticed that it seemed lighter now, less dense. Several of the shadows retracted into the bag as he secured the clasps, but others remained, pooling around my feet like loyal pets reluctant to leave their master. "You've been very accommodating," he said, though his tone suggested this was more observation than gratitude. "It's rare to find someone so receptive to my collection." "What are you?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. His smile widened fractionally. "I'm someone who appreciates the precise moments when people realize their lives have changed irrevocably, when they understand that the future they'd imagined is no longer possible, when hope transforms into acceptance of lesser things." He paused, studying my face with the intensity of an appraiser evaluating a potentially valuable piece. "Those moments have such exquisite flavor, don't you think? So much more complex than simple happiness or obvious tragedy. They require a refined palate to truly appreciate." "And you collect them?" "I preserve them. I give them the attention they deserve." He gestured toward the satchel. "Most people let such moments slip away, dismiss them as mere disappointment or bad luck. But I recognize their value. I ensure they're never forgotten." The shadows around my feet pulsed with what I could only describe as hunger. "The question," he continued, "is whether you'd like to join my collection voluntarily, or if you'd prefer to wait until I return to collect you properly." The offer hung in the air between us like smoke from a dying fire. I looked around the lobby, at the worn carpet, the artificial plants, the fluorescent lights that had hummed their discordant tune throughout this entire encounter. This place had become my world, my entire existence reduced to 12-hour shifts in a roadside purgatory that few people would ever remember visiting. The shadows whispered my name with increasing urgency, and I realized they weren't trying to trap me. They were trying to warn me. They recognized what I was becoming, what I'd already become, and they wanted to offer me a choice while one still existed. I could join them willingly, become another voice in the chorus of preserved moments, maintain some vestige of consciousness within the collection, or I could resist, continue my slow erosion until the guest returned for me later, when I'd be too diminished to even understand what was happening. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked. His smile reached its maximum width, stretching his features into something that was no longer quite human. "Oh, you've already decided. You decided the moment you opened the cabinet. The question is whether you'll admit it to yourself." He turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing with the same odd resonance I'd noticed earlier. At the door, he paused and looked back. "I'll be checking out in the morning. Early. I find dawn to be such a transitional time, perfect for collecting moments when night becomes day, when one phase of existence ends and another begins." The door swung shut behind him, leaving me alone with the shadows and the whispers and the terrible certainty that he was right. I had already decided. I looked down at the darkness pooling around my feet and heard my own voice join the chorus, though I couldn't remember opening my mouth. "Michael." The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune, but now I understood the melody they'd been playing all along. It wasn't discordant noise. It was the sound of collected moments, preserved voices, fragments of human experience singing in harmony, and I was finally learning to sing along. The clock reads 5:47 a.m. as I write this. The guest will be down soon to check out, and when he does, I'll hand over the keys to the night shift that no longer needs a human auditor. The shadows have taught me their song, and I've discovered that I've been practicing for this performance my entire life. If you're reading this, you're probably the day manager, wondering why I've abandoned my post. Don't worry about the Pine Ridge Motor Lodge. It will continue operating exactly as it always has. The only difference is that now it has a more comprehensive security system. Some hotels collect guest signatures, others preserve customer feedback. But this place collects something far more valuable. Those perfect moments when travelers realize they're not going where they thought they were going. When they understand that some roads lead to destinations that don't appear on any map. We'll be here when you're ready. The shadows know your name too, and they've been practicing their whispers. They have such beautiful voices, once you learn to listen properly. And we all float down here in the amber of preserved moments, where the fluorescent lights hum lullabies and the night audit never ends. Story 7. The hydraulics wheezed their final breath as the haunted voyage ground to a halt, leaving me suspended in that peculiar silence that only exists in broken machinery, a void where sound should be. 3 weeks into this job, and I'd already learned to distinguish between the ride's planned pauses and its mechanical failures. This wasn't planned. My flashlight beam carved through the manufactured darkness ahead, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the stagnant air. The guests in my section, 4 college kids who'd been cracking jokes since we left the loading dock, had fallen quiet. Even their nervous laughter had died away, replaced by the kind of hush that creeps into spaces where something feels fundamentally wrong. "Just a minor technical difficulty, folks," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the narrow corridor. The words felt hollow, rehearsed from a training manual I'd barely had time to memorize. "We'll have you moving again in just a minute." But even as I spoke, I knew we were stuck here for a while. The radio clipped to my belt had been crackling with static for the past hour, and the maintenance crew's last update mentioned issues with the mirror chamber's pneumatic systems. We'd stopped directly in front of the Hall of Reflections, or as the senior guides called it, the money shot, the centerpiece of the entire ride experience. I'd guided tourists through this section dozens of times already, watching their faces transform from skeptical amusement to genuine unease as they encountered the mirror maze. The attraction's designers had crafted something special here, an intricate arrangement of angled mirrors and strategic lighting that created the illusion of ghostly figures sitting beside the guests, transparent passengers who seemed to move independently of their reflections. The effect worked flawlessly during normal operation, when the cars rolled smoothly past at precisely the right speed. But sitting stationary like this, with only my flashlight providing illumination, the mirrors had taken on a different quality entirely. They no longer reflected predictable illusions. Instead, they seemed to absorb light, creating pockets of shadow that shifted without any apparent source of movement. "Hey, guide guy," one of the college students called out, a heavy-set kid in a Letterman jacket who'd been particularly vocal during the ride. "How long are we talking here? Because I'm getting some serious claustrophobia vibes." I turned to reassure him, but the words died in my throat. In the mirror directly beside his seat, I could see his reflection clearly enough. But there was something else there too. A darker shape seated next to him, watching me with eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like polished stone. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing tricks on me. The long hours, the stress of a new job, the disorienting environment, all logical explanations for seeing things that weren't there. When I looked again, the reflection showed only the student and empty space beside him. Nothing more. "Shouldn't be much longer," I managed, though my voice sounded strained even to my own ears. The radio crackled to life with a burst of static that made everyone jump. Through the interference, I caught fragments of conversation from the control room. Pneumatic pressure, mirror assembly, indefinite delay. then silence again. As minutes stretched into what felt like hours, I found myself studying the mirrors more intently. The Hall of Reflections had been designed as a classic funhouse effect, curved surfaces and strategic angles that distorted reality in playful ways. But in our current situation, with the emergency lighting casting strange shadows and the air circulation system creating subtle currents that stirred the artificial fog, the mirrors had become something else entirely. I could see myself in the largest mirror, the one positioned directly across from the guide platform where I stood. My reflection looked normal enough. Tired, slightly nervous, but recognizably me. Then I noticed the empty seat beside me in the reflection, the one designated for trainee guides during their observation period. The seat was supposed to be empty, of course. I was working solo tonight. But as I watched, something began to materialize in that reflected seat. At first, it was just a suggestion of movement, a shift in the shadows that might have been caused by the flickering emergency lights. Then the shape began to solidify, becoming more defined with each passing moment. It was me, or rather, it was something that looked like me, but drained of color and warmth. My doppelganger sat with perfect posture, hands folded calmly in its lap, wearing an expression of serene satisfaction that I'd never seen on my own face. Its eyes, my eyes, but somehow not mine, were fixed directly on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I glanced down at the actual seat beside me, empty, just as it should be. But when I looked back at the mirror, my gray double was still there, and now it was smiling. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. My breath began to mist in the artificial fog, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ride's atmospheric effects. The gray version of myself in the mirror was moving now, subtle gestures that didn't match my own movements. It raised one hand in a slow, deliberate wave, then pointed directly at me. "You seeing this?" the Letterman jacket kid whispered, his earlier bravado completely gone. "In the mirror, man. There's something in the mirror." So I wasn't the only one seeing it. That should have been reassuring, but instead it made everything worse. If others could see it too, then this wasn't just fatigue or stress-induced hallucinations. This was something else entirely. The gray figure in the mirror was becoming more animated, its movements growing more pronounced. It was no longer content to simply sit and observe. Instead, it had begun to lean forward, as if trying to push through the glass barrier that separated our reflections from reality. Its smile had widened into something that looked hungry. Then I felt it, a pressure against my back, as if invisible hands were pushing me forward. The sensation was unmistakably real, cold fingers pressing through my uniform shirt, applying steady force that threatened to push me out of my designated position. I stumbled forward a step, then another, moving closer to the mirror where my doppelganger waited with obvious anticipation. "What's happening?" One of the other passengers called out, panic creeping into her voice. "Why are we moving?" But we weren't moving. At least the ride car wasn't. Only I was moving, compelled by forces I couldn't see or understand. The pressure against my back increased, and I found myself taking another involuntary step toward the mirror. My reflection grew larger, more detailed, and I could see that my gray double was no longer simply watching. It was actively reaching out, its hand pressed against the inside surface of the glass as if trying to break through. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Electromagnetic fields from the ride's machinery could cause hallucinations. Carbon monoxide from the fog machines might be affecting our perception. The stress of being trapped in an enclosed space could trigger group hysteria. But even as I cycled through these possibilities, I felt those cold hands pushing me ever closer to the mirror's surface. When I was close enough to see my own breath fogging the glass, something extraordinary happened. My reflection changed. Instead of showing me as I stood there, frightened and confused, it showed the gray version of myself smiling back from my side of the mirror. And in the reflected guide platform, I could see myself, the real me, sitting calmly in that designated seat, hands folded, wearing that same expression of serene satisfaction. We were switching places. Somehow, through forces I couldn't comprehend, my reflection and I were trading positions. The gray version was crossing over into reality while I was being drawn into the mirror world. I tried to step back, to resist the invisible force pushing me forward, but my feet felt rooted to the platform. The cold pressure against my back had intensified, and I could feel myself being pulled toward the glass surface like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The mirror seemed to ripple like water, its solid surface becoming permeable, ready to accept me into its reflected dimension. The gray version of myself was almost through now. I could see it pushing against the glass from the other side, its features becoming more solid, more real with each passing second. Its smile had taken on a quality of triumph, as if it had been waiting for this moment, planning for this exact opportunity. Behind me, the passengers were shouting now, their voices mixing into a cacophony of fear and confusion. But their words seemed to come from very far away, as if I was already halfway between worlds. The mirror's surface was inches from my face, and I could feel its cold emanating through the glass like winter breath. Then, just as I was certain I would be pulled through completely, the lights flickered back to life. The hydraulics coughed and wheezed, and the ride car lurched into motion with a mechanical grinding that sounded like industrial salvation. The spell, whatever it had been, broke instantly. I stumbled backward, gasping, as the car began its programmed journey through the remainder of the attraction. The mirrors returned to their normal function, showing only conventional reflections and the standard ghostly illusions that delighted tourists. My gray double was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. The passengers were buzzing with excitement now, convinced they'd experienced something extraordinary, a malfunction that had enhanced the ride's supernatural atmosphere beyond anything the designers had intended. They were already planning to tell their friends about the incredible effects they'd witnessed, the realistic way the mirrors had seemed to come alive during the breakdown. But I knew better. As we rolled past the final scenes and approached the exit platform, I caught glimpses of myself in the remaining mirrors. Normal reflections, showing a shaken guide in a rumpled uniform trying to regain his composure. Everything appeared to be back to normal, except for one small detail that I noticed only as we pulled into the unloading area. In every reflection, no matter which mirror I looked into, my gray double was sitting calmly in that empty seat beside me. Not moving, not reaching out, not trying to switch places. Just sitting there with that patient smile, as if it was content to wait. After all, it had plenty of time. And tomorrow, there would be another shift, another group of passengers, another opportunity for the mirrors to malfunction at just the right moment. The gray version of myself was no longer trapped in the reflected world. Somehow, during that brief interchange, it had found a way to exist in both dimensions simultaneously. Now it rides with me through every tour, invisible to the passengers but clearly visible in every reflective surface we pass. It never speaks, never gestures, never draws attention to itself. It simply waits with infinite patience for the next opportunity to complete the exchange we'd begun. Sometimes during the quiet moments between tours, I catch myself wondering which one of us is the reflection now. When I look in mirrors, I see my gray passenger smiling back at me from the seat that should be empty. But when I look down at my own hands, at my own reflection in the ride car's polished surfaces, I can't shake the feeling that I'm the one who's lost some essential quality of warmth and color. The other guides have started to comment that I seem different somehow, more distant, less engaged with the tourists. They say my voice has taken on a monotone quality during the tours, that I smile at strange moments and seem to be listening to conversations that no one else can hear. They're probably right. After all, spending your days in the space between reflection and reality tends to blur the boundaries. And every time the ride breaks down in the mirror chamber, which happens with increasing frequency, I feel that familiar cold pressure against my back, urging me forward toward the glass. One day, I know I'll complete the journey my gray double began. One day I'll step through that mirror and take my place in the reflected world, leaving my passenger to guide the tours in my place. The passengers will never know the difference. They'll see the same face, hear the same rehearsed explanations, receive the same reassuring words when the ride breaks down. But in the mirrors, they'll catch glimpses of the real me, sitting patiently in that designated seat, wearing an expression of serene satisfaction as I wait for my replacement to join me in the space between reflections. Because that's how it works in the Hall of Reflections. Everyone gets their turn on both sides of the glass. The only question is which side is real, and which is just a reflection of what we used to be. Story 8. The ritual began innocently enough. Every weekday at exactly 4:23 p.m., the white panel van would cruise down Maple Street, and my brother and I would be there, crouched behind the rusted mailbox at the corner of our yard, notebooks ready. We'd started the game 3 months ago, amateur detectives tracking patterns, recording license plates, building what we called our neighborhood surveillance database. The van was our most reliable subject. License plate number KJH7829, driver always wearing a dark baseball cap, passenger seat perpetually empty, speed never exceeding 25 miles per hour. The van's punctuality was almost supernatural, not 4:22, not 4:24, always 4:23 on the dot. My brother had started timing it with his digital watch, the one with the obnoxious beeping alarm that he'd set to sound at 4:20 as our 3-minute warning. We'd drop whatever we were doing and assume our positions. 2 17-year-old boys playing at being private investigators, documenting the mundane movements of suburban traffic. The driver never looked our way, never slowed, never deviated from his route. That consistency should have been comforting, but there was something about the van's mechanical precision that made my skin crawl. The way it moved through the neighborhood felt deliberate, purposeful, like it was mapping our streets, cataloging our routines. My brother thought I was being paranoid. He'd laugh when I mentioned the way the van's windows seemed too dark, too reflective, or how the engine made a distinct humming sound that lingered in my ears long after it disappeared around the corner. To him, we were just 2 kids with too much time and overactive imaginations. To me, we were witnesses to something that didn't quite fit. The first disruption came on a Thursday in October. I'd been fighting off a fever for 2 days, and my brother had decided to skip our surveillance session to hang out with friends from school. The 4:23 van made its usual pass. I could hear its distinctive hum from my bedroom window. But for the first time in 3 months, no one was there to document it. The envelope appeared in our mailbox the next morning. No postmark, no return address. Just our last name scrawled across the front in block letters that looked like they'd been traced with a ruler. Inside, a single photograph, my brother and me, standing exactly where we always positioned ourselves behind the mailbox, notebooks in hand. But something was wrong with the image. Fundamentally, impossibly wrong. We were wearing clothes we didn't own. I stared at the photograph for nearly 10 minutes, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. There I was, unmistakably me, but dressed in a burgundy sweater I'd never seen before. My brother wore a jacket that was definitely not in his closet, navy blue with silver zippers and a logo I didn't recognize. Our faces were clearly visible, expressions focused and alert, exactly as we looked during our surveillance sessions. But the clothes... My brother's initial reaction was confusion, then mild amusement. He suggested it might be some kind of photo manipulation, maybe someone with too much time and access to image editing software. But the quality was too pristine, too natural. The lighting matched the typical late afternoon shadows on our street. Our poses were authentic, unforced, and there was something in our expressions, a familiarity, a comfort, that suggested this wasn't a staged recreation. We decided to maintain our routine, but with heightened attention. The van continued its daily appearances, as punctual as ever. We documented everything: the angle of the sun on its windshield, the slight rust spot near the rear wheel well, the way dust motes danced in its wake. Nothing changed, yet everything felt different. I found myself watching the van with the intensity of prey studying a predator, searching for any sign that its driver was aware of our presence. The second photograph arrived after we missed another session, this time because of a sudden downpour that sent us scrambling for shelter. Again, no postmark. Again, the same precise block lettering. This image showed us in different clothes entirely. Me in a gray Henley with rolled sleeves, my brother in a green flannel shirt that looked expensive, well made. We were positioned at our usual spot, but the lighting suggested early morning rather than late afternoon. That's when the real fear began to settle in. I started paying obsessive attention to every piece of clothing in my wardrobe, memorizing each shirt, each pair of jeans, each jacket. I photographed my entire closet with my phone, creating a digital inventory that I checked and rechecked. My brother did the same, though with considerably less urgency. He still treated the whole situation as an elaborate prank or some kind of social experiment. But I could feel something shifting in the atmosphere around our house. The air itself seemed heavier during the hours approaching 4:23 p.m. Sounds became sharper, more distinct. The grinding of distant construction, the whisper of leaves against pavement, the low rumble of approaching engines. I developed an almost supernatural awareness of time, my internal clock becoming hyper-tuned to the van's arrival. The third photograph came after a missed session due to a dentist appointment. This time the image showed us in winter clothing, heavy coats, wool scarves, gloves. But it was still October. The trees in the background of the photo were bare, the ground appeared frost-covered, and our breath was visible in small white puffs. We looked older somehow. Our faces carried a weariness that I didn't recognize, a tension that seemed etched into our features. My brother's confidence began to waver. He spent long minutes studying the photograph, tracing his finger along the edges, holding it up to different light sources. He asked questions that had no satisfying answers. How were these images being produced? Who was taking them? Why were we being watched? But the most disturbing question was one neither of us voiced aloud. When were these photographs taken? I began experiencing episodes of displaced time, moments where I'd find myself standing at the mailbox with no memory of walking there, or discovering that hours had passed while I sat motionless at my desk. My brother reported similar experiences, though he attributed them to stress and lack of sleep. We were both becoming increasingly fixated on the van, on the photographs, on the growing certainty that our reality was being manipulated by forces we couldn't comprehend. The fourth photograph showed us in spring clothing. Light jackets, new sneakers, t-shirts in colors I'd never worn. My brother appeared to have a haircut that was subtly different from his current style, and I noticed what looked like a small scar on my left hand that didn't exist. The background showed our street in full bloom, with flowers and green grass that wouldn't appear for months. By this point, we'd stopped treating the surveillance as a game. Our notebooks filled with increasingly frantic observations, sketches of the van from every conceivable angle, attempts to decode patterns in the timing and content of the photographs. We researched the license plate number, cross-referenced it with public records, even called the DMV pretending to report a hit-and-run incident. The plate didn't exist in any system we could access. I started leaving the house earlier each day, positioning myself at various locations along the van's route, trying to catch sight of the driver's face or identify where the vehicle went after it passed our street. But the van seemed to materialize precisely at 4:23 p.m. and dissolve into the suburban landscape immediately afterward. I never saw it arrive or leave, only that single constant passage through our neighborhood. The fifth photograph arrived after we deliberately skipped a session, hiding inside the house and watching from behind closed curtains. The image showed us at our usual position, but in clothes that looked formal, expensive, suits that fit perfectly, dress shoes that gleamed with fresh polish. Our postures were different too, more confident, more mature. We looked like adult versions of ourselves, successful and self-assured in ways that seemed impossible to fake. That night, I dreamed about the van. In the dream, I was standing in the street as it approached, and instead of passing by, it slowed to a stop directly in front of me. The driver's window rolled down, revealing nothing but darkness. Not the absence of a person, but the presence of void itself. The darkness spoke without words, communicating through some form of direct neural transmission that bypassed my ears entirely. It told me about time, about the malleable nature of causality, about photographs that existed before the moments they depicted. It explained that observation changed the observed, that our surveillance had created a feedback loop between present and future, between what was and what would be. The van, it said, was both consequence and cause, documenting our lives while simultaneously creating the timeline it recorded. I woke up with the taste of copper in my mouth and the absolute certainty that the dream was not a dream. The sixth photograph came without our missing a session. We were both there at 4:23 p.m., notebooks ready, when the van made its usual pass. The envelope appeared in our mailbox the next morning anyway. This image showed us in winter again, but different winter clothes from the previous cold weather photograph. We looked exhausted, hollow-eyed, like people who hadn't slept properly in months. The setting appeared to be early evening rather than late afternoon, and snow was falling around us in thick, heavy flakes. But the most disturbing detail was barely visible in the background, a second figure standing in the shadows beside our house, watching us watch the street. The figure was too distant and too dark to identify, but its presence transformed the entire composition from surveillance to counter-surveillance. My brother stopped sleeping. I could hear him moving around the house at all hours, checking locks, peering through windows, muttering to himself in words too quiet to distinguish. During the day, he maintained a veneer of normalcy, but his eyes had developed a constant vigilance that made conversation feel like an interrogation. We both began to notice things that might have been there all along but somehow escaped our attention. The way certain neighbors never seemed to be outside during the van's passage. How some houses always had their curtains drawn at exactly the wrong moments. The fact that mail delivery never coincided with our 4:23 p.m. surveillance sessions. The seventh photograph showed us in summer clothing, standing not behind the mailbox, but directly in the street, blocking the van's path. Our faces were turned toward the camera, expressions unreadable, as if we were posing deliberately rather than conducting surveillance. Behind us, the van sat motionless, its driver's door hanging open, revealing an empty seat. That image changed everything. We were no longer observers in someone else's experiment. We were participants in our own entrapment. I spent 3 days trying to convince myself that the photographs were elaborate fakes, that someone was playing an impossibly sophisticated prank, that there had to be a rational explanation for images that showed us in future circumstances we'd never experienced. But the evidence was accumulating beyond the possibility of coincidence or manipulation. The clothes in the photographs were real. I'd started finding them in stores, exactly as depicted. The burgundy sweater in a downtown boutique, the gray Henley in a catalog that arrived in our mail. The prices were astronomical, far beyond what we could afford. But there they were, perfect matches for garments we'd allegedly worn but never owned. My brother suggested we stop the surveillance entirely, abandon our positions at 4:23 p.m. and see if the photographs would stop arriving. But I knew, with the certainty that comes from dreams that aren't dreams, that the van would continue its passage whether we were there to witness it or not. The photographs weren't documenting our presence. They were documenting our inevitability. Yesterday I bought the burgundy sweater. I told myself it was an experiment, a way to test the boundaries of whatever was happening to us. But as I handed over the money, more than I'd ever spent on clothing, I understood that choice wasn't involved. The sweater felt familiar in my hands, like something I'd owned for years rather than seconds. Tonight my brother bought the navy jacket with silver zippers. We haven't discussed our purchases, but we both know what's happening. The photographs aren't predicting our future, they're creating it. Each image is a destination we're being pulled toward, a moment we're being shaped to inhabit. Tomorrow is Friday. At exactly 4:23 p.m., a white panel van will pass down Maple Street. My brother and I will be there, positioned behind the mailbox, notebooks in hand. We'll be wearing clothes we never chose but somehow acquired, living moments we never planned, but somehow can't avoid. And somewhere, in a time that hasn't happened yet but somehow already has, someone will be taking our photograph. Story 9. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days when I first noticed them. I'd been holed up in my cabin since the storm began, watching the world disappear behind walls of white. The wind howled like something wounded, rattling the windows with fingers of ice. But it was the silence between the gusts that unnerved me most. Those pregnant pauses when the storm seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to emerge from the white void beyond my door. That's when I saw the first set of tracks. They appeared during one of those eerie lulls, materializing in the snow like dark wounds against the pristine surface. From my kitchen window I could trace their path. They emerged from the tree line, wound across my yard in deliberate, measured steps, and disappeared around the corner of the house, toward the basement entrance. The logical part of my mind supplied reasonable explanations. A lost hiker seeking shelter. An animal, though no animal I knew walked with such purpose, such intention. But logic felt thin in the howling dark, stretched gossamer fine against the weight of something I couldn't name. I grabbed my flashlight and winter coat, steeling myself against the bite of Arctic air. The storm swallowed me the moment I stepped outside, snow stinging my face like needle-sharp accusations. I followed the tracks, my beam cutting through the swirling white. Each footprint was deeper than the last, as if whatever made them grew heavier with each step. The impressions were human-shaped but wrong somehow. Too elongated, with spacing that suggested an unnatural gait. They led exactly where I'd feared, to the slanted wooden doors that covered my basement entrance. The doors I'd locked from the inside 6 months ago and hadn't opened since. Yet they stood ajar now, darkness yawning between them like a hungry mouth. I descended the concrete steps, flashlight beam dancing across stone walls that wept with condensation. The basement smelled of earth and something else, something cold and old, like water that had never seen sunlight. My foot kicked something metallic, and when I looked down, my stomach clenched. The padlock I'd installed lay open, its metal bright and unmarked by rust, as if it had been opened from the inside. But that was impossible. The only other exit was through the house, through rooms I'd occupied for the past 3 days. I swept the flashlight across the basement's familiar contents. Old furniture draped in sheets, boxes of forgotten belongings, the ancient furnace that wheezed and groaned even in summer. Everything appeared undisturbed, yet something felt fundamentally wrong. The air itself seemed thicker, pregnant with an expectation I couldn't define. That night, I triple-checked every lock in the house and dragged a chair against the basement door for good measure. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of footsteps overhead and the sound of something scraping against glass. I woke to find new tracks. These were different, deeper, more deliberate. They formed a rough circle around the house, always maintaining the same distance from the walls, as if whatever made them was studying the structure, learning its weaknesses. But it was their endpoint that made my blood run cold. They led not just to the basement entrance, but inside it, disappearing into the darkness below. This time, when I followed them down, I discovered something that made my hands shake. The tracks didn't end at the bottom of the stairs. They continued across the concrete floor, weaving between my stored possessions with intimate familiarity, before stopping directly beneath the basement window, the window that looked up at my bedroom. I aimed my flashlight upward, illuminating the grimy glass. For a moment, I thought I saw something looking back, a pale suggestion of features pressed against the opposite side. But when I blinked, there was nothing but my own reflection, distorted and strange. The tracks appeared again the following night, and the next. Each time they grew more complex, more purposeful. What had begun as simple trails evolved into intricate patterns, symbols etched into the snow with deliberate precision. I recognized some of them from half-remembered folklore, protective wards, summoning circles, binding marks older than written history. Yet recognition brought no comfort, only the gnawing certainty that something was systematically preparing for an event I couldn't comprehend. I tried photographing the symbols, but the images came out blurred, as if the patterns themselves resisted documentation. I attempted to research their meanings online, but the internet connection had died with the storm, leaving me isolated with my growing dread. The worst part was how the snow reacted when I tried to disturb the tracks. The first time I attempted to obliterate a particularly complex symbol, the snow hardened beneath my boots, transforming from powder to something resembling frosted glass. My footprints made no impression, and when I scraped at the surface with a shovel, the metal rang against it like striking crystal. That night I pressed my face to the basement window, trying to see what lay beneath that glassy surface. The distorted view revealed layers of ice forming geometric patterns, but deeper still, I glimpsed something that made me stumble backward. Eyes, pale and unblinking, staring up from within the frozen ground itself. The rational mind is a fragile thing. Mine began its slow dissolution on the fourth night, when I realized the footprints had appeared inside the house. I found them pressed into the carpet of my living room. The same elongated impressions, but dry now, outlined in what looked like frost crystals. They led from the basement door, through my kitchen, and up the stairs toward my bedroom. I followed them with mounting horror, noting how they paused at doorways as if their maker had stopped to observe, to learn, to plan. They ended at my bedside. I examined the carpet with scientific precision, searching for logical explanations. Perhaps condensation from my heating system had created ice patterns that resembled footprints. Maybe stress and isolation were generating hallucinations. But when I photographed the impressions with my phone, they appeared clearly in the digital image. Too solid, too real to dismiss as imagination. That realization prompted me to review the photos I'd taken of the outdoor symbols. In the phone's memory, the blurred images had somehow clarified themselves. The symbols were indeed ancient, protective circles and binding marks, but arranged in reverse, their meanings inverted. Not wards against intrusion, but invitations. Summoning marks designed to draw something from a place where it didn't belong. I spent that night seated in a chair facing the basement door, every light in the house blazing. Around 3 a.m. I heard the scraping begin, a sound like fingernails dragged across glass, emanating from somewhere beneath the floor. It started softly but grew in intensity, accompanied by what might have been footsteps or might have been the settling of old wood. The scraping followed a pattern, I realized. The same rhythm I'd observed in the symbol formations outside. Whatever was down there wasn't randomly scratching at the glass barrier between worlds. It was methodically working to weaken it. When dawn finally broke, I forced myself back down to the basement. The concrete floor had changed overnight. What had been solid ground now showed stress fractures radiating outward from the center of the room. Hairline splits that revealed glimpses of that same glassy substance beneath. The cracks formed their own pattern, a web of interconnected lines that resembled a map of some underground territory I didn't want to explore. I pressed my ear to the largest crack and heard something that liquefied my courage. Breathing that wasn't quite human, accompanied by a wet sliding sound, as if something was moving through water far below. The phone rang then, a sound so mundane it felt surreal. The caller ID showed only static, but when I answered, I heard my own voice speaking words I'd never said. "The glass is almost ready. Soon we won't need the symbols anymore." I hung up, but the phone continued ringing. Each time I answered, my voice spoke different words, fragments of conversations I might have in the future, or perhaps in some parallel version of reality where I'd already succumbed to whatever was happening. The final call chilled me most. My voice, tired and defeated, simply saying, "I understand now. I've been down here all along." That evening, as I watched through the window, the symbols in the snow began to glow with a pale, phosphorescent light. The illumination pulsed in sync with something I felt rather than heard, a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, as if whatever was beneath the glass was synchronizing itself with my biological processes. The footprints appeared again, but this time they didn't lead to the basement. They started at the basement entrance and led away, disappearing into the storm, as if whatever had been visiting me nightly had finally found what it needed and departed for destinations unknown. But the relief I felt proved premature. When I descended to check the basement one final time, I discovered the truth that shattered my remaining sanity. The footprints down there weren't leading toward the window anymore. They were leading away from it. The glass beneath the concrete had finally given way, revealing a portal into a space that defied geometry. Through the opening, I could see my own basement from below, but inverted and wrong. A mirror image where the shadows fell upward, and the familiar objects cast impossible reflections. In that inverted space, I glimpsed my doppelganger moving about the familiar rooms, following the same routines I'd maintained for days. But this other version of myself moved with that same elongated gait I'd observed in the snow, and when it turned toward the opening, its face bore features that were almost but not quite my own. The worst revelation came when I realized the reflection wasn't limited to the basement. Every window in the house now showed glimpses of that other place, where another version of myself went through the motions of normal life, while something else, something that had learned to mimic my patterns with disturbing accuracy, prepared to take my place in this reality. I write this now from my bedroom, though I'm no longer certain which bedroom it truly is. The walls feel subtly wrong, the angles slightly off. My reflection in the mirror moves a fraction of a second behind my actual movements, and sometimes I catch it performing actions I didn't make. The snow has stopped falling, but the symbols remain, glowing softly in the darkness beyond my windows. The basement door stands open, though I don't remember unlocking it, and somewhere in the house, above me or below me or perhaps existing in the space between spaces, footsteps continue their patient circuit, wearing paths through a reality that grows thinner with each passing hour. The phone rings occasionally, but I no longer answer. I know it's my voice on the other end, and I know what it's trying to tell me. The question that haunts my remaining hours isn't whether I've lost my mind, but whether the mind I've lost was ever truly mine to begin with. Outside, new tracks are forming in the snow, leading away from the house toward a destination I can't see. They're deeper now, more purposeful, as if whatever made them has finally learned to carry the full weight of human existence. And in the glass beneath my feet, something that looks exactly like me is learning to breathe air instead of whatever sustains it in that place below the world. Story 10. The maintenance worker appeared during the lunch break, standing beside the old playground equipment like he'd materialized from the morning mist. His coveralls bore no company logo, just a generic plastic badge that caught the pale autumn light wrong, reflecting nothing back. The metal slide behind him gleamed with condensation, and the swing chains hung motionless in air so still, it felt deliberately held. I'd been grading papers on the bench when his shadow fell across my stack of assignments. The shadow seemed too long for the position of the sun, stretching toward the drainage grate beneath the monkey bars with unnatural precision. When I looked up, his face held that particular emptiness of someone delivering bad news they didn't quite understand themselves. He needed help with the pipes, he said. Something about blockage underneath the playground. The words came out flat and rehearsed like he'd practiced them in a mirror until they lost all meaning. His eyes never quite met mine, instead focusing on some point just behind my shoulder where nothing existed except empty air and the distant brick wall of the school building. I told him I was just a teacher, that maintenance issues weren't my responsibility. The words felt reasonable leaving my mouth, but they seemed to hang in the air between us longer than they should have, growing heavier with each passing second. He nodded as if he'd expected my response, then repeated his request with the exact same inflection, the exact same pause between pipes and underneath. The repetition sent something cold crawling up my spine. The afternoon wore on, but he remained. Through my classroom window during fifth period, I could see him standing by the playground, occasionally gesturing toward the drainage system as if explaining the problem to invisible supervisors. Students began to notice him too, their attention drifting from algebraic equations to the solitary figure who never seemed to move beyond a 5-foot radius of the monkey bars. When the final bell rang and the building emptied, I found myself walking toward the playground, despite every rational instinct screaming against it. The custodial staff had gone home. The parking lot lay deserted, except for my car and a single white van with tinted windows that hadn't been there that morning. The van bore no identifying marks, its license plate obscured by what looked like deliberately caked mud. He was waiting by the drainage grate, crouched now with his hands pressed flat against the metal grating. Up close, his coveralls revealed strange details I hadn't noticed from a distance. The fabric wasn't quite the right texture for work clothes, too smooth and synthetic, like costume material. The generic badge held no name, no company, just a blank square of white plastic that somehow managed to be more unsettling than any corporate logo would have been. The problem, he explained without looking up, was serious. Water couldn't flow properly through the pipes. Children's safety was at stake if the drainage failed during the next heavy rain. The playground would flood, creating hazardous conditions. His voice maintained that same rehearsed quality, but now I could hear something underneath it. Not urgency exactly, but a kind of desperate insistence that felt wrong. I knelt beside the grate and peered down into the darkness. The metal was ice cold against my palms, much colder than the moderate October temperature should have allowed. The smell rising from below wasn't the expected mustiness of stagnant water, but something else. Fabric softener and chalk dust, achingly familiar yet completely out of place in a drainage system. The worker handed me a flashlight without being asked, and that simple gesture felt like crossing some invisible line I hadn't known existed. The flashlight was too heavy, its metal casing worn smooth in places where hands had gripped it countless times. When I clicked it on, the beam revealed more than I was prepared to see. Small hands pressed against the sides of the pipe, but not hands exactly. Cloth hands, sewn with careful stitches and stuffed with something that gave them the proper shape and weight. Each hand was attached to an arm, and each arm to a small torso wrapped in familiar blue fabric. My breath caught in my throat as recognition hit like a physical blow. The fabric was unmistakable. The same blue cotton of my old elementary school uniform, the one I'd worn decades ago to this very building. The one my mother had carefully labeled with my name in permanent marker before that first day of kindergarten. The one that had been lost when my family moved across town, never to be seen again. But here it was, sewn into small figures that couldn't quite be called dolls because dolls implied something harmless, something made for play. These were different. These were made with purpose I couldn't begin to understand. The worker's voice reached me as if from a great distance, explaining about pressure and flow, and the urgent need to clear the obstruction. But I couldn't focus on his words because the button eyes of the cloth figures had begun to move, tracking the beam of my flashlight with mechanical precision. Black buttons sewn to cloth faces, but moving with the deliberate attention of living things. I jerked the flashlight beam away, but in my peripheral vision, I could swear the button eyes continued to follow its movement. The worker was still talking, his voice now carrying an edge of impatience that felt threatening despite its conversational tone. He needed me to reach down and grab the figures, to pull them free so the water could flow properly. Simple maintenance work, really. Nothing complicated. My hands shook as I held the flashlight, sending the beam dancing wildly across the pipe walls. With each movement of the light, the button eyes seemed to track more aggressively, as if my nervousness was somehow feeding their animation. The smell of fabric softener grew stronger, mixed now with something else, the particular scent of elementary school classrooms, that combination of crayon wax and floor cleaner that existed nowhere else in the world. The worker's hand fell on my shoulder, and his touch was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Too cold, too firm, too deliberate. He guided my hand toward the grate opening, and I found myself unable to resist despite every instinct screaming against it. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute, like being held by machinery rather than flesh. As my hand descended toward the opening, the cloth figures seemed to shift position, arranging themselves in anticipation. Their button eyes all turned upward now, fixed on my approaching fingers with hungry attention. The stitching that held them together caught the flashlight beam, revealing needlework so precise it seemed impossible to have been done by human hands. But it was the labels that finally broke my paralysis. Sewn into the collar of each cloth figure, written in my mother's careful handwriting, was my name. Not just any name, but my full name as she'd written it all those years ago, complete with the little flourish she'd added to the final letter. The same name, repeated on every figure, as if they were all versions of the same person at different stages of some unimaginable process. I yanked my hand back so violently that I lost my balance, falling backward onto the playground's rubberized surface. The flashlight flew from my grip, landing with a metallic clatter that echoed off the empty school building. In the sudden darkness, I could hear the workers breathing, steady and patient as a machine waiting for the next command. When I scrambled to retrieve the flashlight, its beam revealed the drainage grate exactly as it had been before. Clean metal bars over what looked like perfectly normal pipes. No cloth figures, no button eyes, no blue fabric from a uniform I'd worn 30 years ago. Just standard municipal drainage, the kind found beneath every playground in every city. The worker stood beside me, his expression unchanged, as if nothing had happened. He thanked me for my time and explained that the problem had resolved itself, as these things sometimes did. Pressure changes in the system, he said. Very common. Nothing to worry about. His voice had returned to that same flat, rehearsed quality, but now I could hear something else underneath it. Satisfaction, perhaps, or completion. He walked away toward the white van, his footsteps making no sound on the asphalt. I watched him drive away, noting how the van's headlights never turned on despite the gathering dusk, and how its taillights remained dark even as it disappeared around the corner. The next morning, I found a note in my classroom mailbox. It was written on school letterhead in handwriting I didn't recognize, thanking me for my assistance with the maintenance issue. The note was signed with an illegible scrawl and dated 3 days in the future. When I showed it to the principal, she looked at me with concern and suggested I might be working too hard, that perhaps I should consider taking a few days off. But it's not stress, and it's not imagination. Because every morning since that afternoon, I find small blue threads caught on my classroom door handle. They're always there when I arrive, but gone by lunch, as if someone removes them during the hours when I'm teaching. The threads are the exact shade of blue as that long-lost school uniform, and they smell faintly of fabric softener and chalk dust. And sometimes, in the corner of my vision while I'm writing on the blackboard, I catch glimpses of button eyes watching me from the window. They're only there for a fraction of a second, never long enough for me to turn and confirm what I've seen. But I know they're there, patient and waiting, sewn into fabric that should have been discarded decades ago. The maintenance worker hasn't returned, but his van drives past the school every Tuesday at exactly 3:15. Its windows too tinted to see inside. And every Tuesday, I find myself drawn to the playground after the students have gone home, standing over the drainage grate with a flashlight in my hand, wondering what I might see if I looked down into the darkness again, wondering if those button eyes are still watching me from below, sewn to figures made from pieces of my past that were supposed to stay buried, wondering if the worker with the generic badge is somewhere in the network of pipes beneath the city, carefully arranging more cloth figures and waiting for the next person who'll be curious enough to look, wondering if the threads on my door handle are messages or warnings, or simply evidence that some maintenance work is never really finished. The flashlight grows heavier in my hand each Tuesday, but I never quite find the courage to turn it on, because deep down, beneath all the rational explanations and reasonable doubts, I know exactly what I would see in those pipes, and I know that this time, when the button eyes turn to follow my light, they won't be alone. There would be more figures now, more pieces of blue fabric sewn with impossible precision, more versions of something that was once me, waiting in the darkness beneath the playground where children laugh and play, unaware of what watches them from below. And maybe, if I listened carefully enough in the silence after the school empties, I would hear the sound of sewing machines working in the pipes, creating new figures for new purposes I'm not ready to understand. The maintenance never really ends. It just moves deeper underground, where the work can continue undisturbed. Story 11. The convention center's main ballroom thrummed with artificial thunder, strobing lights casting shadows that danced like living things across walls draped in synthetic cobwebs. I adjusted my jacket, a simple black blazer over dark jeans, my concession to the costume requirement, and wondered why I'd let my coworker convince me to attend this cosplay event. The air tasted metallic, heavy with dry ice fog, and the chemical sweetness of hairspray from elaborate wigs. Around me, hundreds of figures moved in careful choreography, their costumes ranging from intricate armor that must have taken months to craft to simple accessories thrown together at the last minute. The band on stage, 4 musicians dressed as various movie villains, played covers of science fiction soundtracks with surprising skill. Their current selection, a haunting rendition of the main theme from that space opera everyone knew, filled the cavernous room with orchestral weight. I moved toward the refreshment table, navigating between a towering robot costume and someone dressed as a witch, when the sensation first hit me. Eyes. Not the casual glances of other attendees admiring costumes or seeking familiar faces, but something more focused, more intent. The feeling crawled up my spine like ice water, and I turned slowly, scanning the crowd. That's when I saw him. The figure stood perhaps 30 feet away, motionless among the swaying dancers. His costume appeared simple at first glance, a dark hooded robe that could have belonged to any number of fictional characters. But the mask drew my attention and held it with magnetic force. It was perfectly smooth, featureless except for two dark eye holes, crafted from what looked like porcelain or high-quality plastic. The surface reflected the room's chaotic lighting in strange ways, sometimes appearing pure white, other times seeming to absorb the colors around it. What unsettled me most was his stillness. While everyone else moved to the music, talked, or adjusted their costumes, he simply stood there, watching me. I forced myself to look away, focusing on pouring punch into a plastic cup. The sweet liquid tasted flat, artificial. When I glanced back, the figure had moved closer. Not walking. I hadn't seen him take a single step, but somehow he now stood only 20 feet away. The crowd between us should have blocked his path, yet there he was, as if he'd simply materialized in a new position. My hands began to shake slightly. I set down the cup and decided to lose myself in the crowd, perhaps find the coworker who'd invited me and make some excuse to leave early. The evening had lost whatever appeal it might have possessed. I pushed through clusters of costumed attendees, their conversations creating a wall of sound that should have been comforting, but instead felt oppressive. Laughter rang too sharp, voices pitched too high. Even the music from the stage seemed to take on an edge it hadn't possessed before. I couldn't shake the crawling certainty that the masked figure was following me, though every time I turned to look, the press of bodies made it impossible to spot him clearly. The feeling of being hunted intensified as I made my way toward the far end of the ballroom. My chest tightened, breath coming shorter. This was ridiculous. I was a grown man getting spooked by someone in a costume at a party. Yet rational thought couldn't dispel the primitive alarm signals firing in my brain. I spotted an alcove near the emergency exit where several large potted plants created a natural barrier. Perfect. I could catch my breath there, maybe send a text to my coworker, and plan my escape. The space was dimly lit, offering a reprieve from the strobing main lights, and I felt my pulse begin to slow as I settled behind the largest plant. That's when the music changed. It didn't stop or shift to a new song. Instead, the familiar melody began to warp, as if someone was slowly turning down the volume, while simultaneously distorting the audio through cheap speakers. The orchestral arrangement dissolved into something thin and reedy, then further into what sounded almost like whispering. I pressed closer to the plant, straining to make out the words. The sound seemed to come from the speakers, but also from the walls themselves, from the very air around me. Multiple voices, all saying the same phrase in perfect unison, over and over. May the force be with you. May the force be with you. May the force be with you. The words that should have been comforting, a familiar quote from beloved films, instead carried a weight of menace that made my skin crawl. The voices spoke in monotone, emotionless, like a recording played at the wrong speed. And beneath the words, I could swear I heard something else, a sound like fabric rustling or footsteps on carpet, drawing closer. I peered around the edge of the plant. The masked figure stood at the entrance to my alcove. Up close, I could see details that made my mouth go dry. The robe wasn't simply dark, it seemed to absorb light, creating a void in human shape. But it was the mask that truly terrified me. What I'd taken for porcelain or plastic revealed itself as something else entirely. The surface had depth, layers visible through the eye holes like looking into a hall of mirrors. And the eyes behind those holes. There were no eyes, just darkness. And deeper in that darkness, the faint suggestion of another mask. And behind that mask, another. An infinite regression of identical faces, each one somehow smaller and more distant than the last. The figure raised one arm toward me, fingers extending from the sleeve. The hand appeared normal at first, but as I stared, I realized the proportions were wrong. The fingers too long, joints bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. When he beckoned, the motion looked like a marionette operated by someone who'd never seen a human being move. May the force be with you. The whispers continued, now clearly coming from everywhere at once. The phrase that had once been a blessing between friends now sounded like a curse, a summoning, a trap closing around me. I pressed myself against the wall behind the plants, hoping the figure might pass by, that this was all some elaborate prank or performance art piece gone too far. But he stepped into the alcove, that impossible hand still extended, and I could smell something like old paper and dust, as if he carried the scent of abandoned places. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Other costumed figures began to appear at the alcove's entrance. A robot, a witch, a space marine, a dozen others I recognized from my circuit around the room, but they all stood the same way now, with that unnatural stillness, and though I couldn't see their faces clearly through their various masks and makeup, I sensed they were all watching me with the same hollow attention. Panic finally overrode paralysis. I shoved past the plants and bolted for the emergency exit, shoulder-checking the masked figure as I passed. The contact felt wrong, not solid like striking another person, but yielding, as if the robe contained something soft and shifting rather than flesh and bone. The exit door slammed open under my weight, and I stumbled into a service corridor lined with industrial gray walls and harsh fluorescent lighting. The sudden silence felt deafening after the constant noise of the ballroom. No music, no voices, no whispers, just the buzz of the lights overhead and my own ragged breathing. I ran. The corridor stretched longer than it should have, past doors marked with warnings about authorized personnel and electrical equipment. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being played back a fraction of a second after I made it. Behind me, I heard the exit door open again, followed by the soft whisper of fabric against the floor. He was following me. I risked a glance back and saw not just the original figure, but several of the other costumed attendees filing through the door in single file. They moved with that same puppet-like quality, joints bending at awkward angles, heads tilted at uniform degrees. And from somewhere, the walls, the ceiling, the air itself, came that cursed phrase, growing in volume and urgency. May the Force be with you. May the Force be with you. May the Force be with you. A maintenance door appeared on my left, marked authorized personnel only in peeling letters. I tried the handle desperately and found it unlocked. The room beyond was small, cramped with electrical panels and cleaning supplies, but it had another door on the far side. I squeezed through the maze of equipment and emerged into what looked like a loading dock. The space was massive, filled with shadows and the hulking shapes of delivery trucks. Safety lights provided minimal illumination, creating pools of sickly yellow that only emphasized the darkness between them. I could hear my pursuers in the maintenance room behind me, their movements accompanied by sounds like shifting sand and rustling leaves. I picked my way between the trucks, seeking another exit. The whispering had grown so loud it seemed to come from inside my own head. The familiar words, now meaningless syllables, repeated until they lost all connection to human speech. My vision began to blur at the edges, and I wondered if I was having some kind of breakdown, if the stress of work and life had finally pushed me over some invisible edge. That's when I saw them. More figures stood between the trucks, dozens of them, all wearing variations of the same smooth mask. Some wore the hooded robes, others dressed as the various costumed characters I'd seen in the ballroom. But the masks were identical, that same perfect, featureless surface with the infinite regression of faces behind the eye holes. They formed a loose circle around me, closing in slowly. As they drew nearer, I could see that the masks weren't quite identical after all. Some showed hairline cracks. Others had developed a yellow patina around the edges. A few displayed dark stains that could have been anything. But behind every mask, that same horrible depth, layer upon layer of identical faces receding into a darkness that hurt to look at. The figure from the ballroom emerged from between two trucks, and I realized he was larger than the others. Or perhaps the perspective was wrong, or perhaps my perception was failing entirely. He raised both hands toward me now, and I saw that his sleeves had fallen back to reveal arms that were far too long, far too thin, joints visible as bumps beneath skin that looked like parchment. "May the Force be with you," he said, and this time the voice came clearly from him. though it sounded like multiple people speaking in unison. The other figures took up the chant, their voices layering until the words became a wall of sound that pressed against me from all sides. I closed my eyes, certain this was the end of whatever was happening to me, whether it was real or imagined. The chanting grew so loud it seemed to shake the building, and I felt hands, too many hands, with too many joints, reaching for me. Then silence. I opened my eyes to find myself alone in the loading dock. No figures, no masks, no impossible anatomy. Just me, standing among the trucks in the weak light of the safety lamps. In the distance, I could hear the muffled sound of music from the ballroom, normal music, playing normal songs for normal people having a normal evening. I made my way back through the service corridors, following exit signs until I found myself in the convention center's main lobby. The ballroom doors stood open, revealing the ongoing party in all its colorful chaos. People danced, talked, laughed. The band played requests. Everything looked exactly as it had when I'd first arrived. I approached the doors cautiously, scanning the crowd for any sign of the masked figures. Nothing. Just regular people in creative costumes, enjoying themselves at a themed event. The relief was so overwhelming, I nearly collapsed. That's when I noticed my reflection in the glass doors. The face looking back at me was smooth, featureless except for 2 dark eye holes. Behind those holes I could see another face, and behind that face, another. An infinite progression of identical masks, each one somehow smaller and more distant than the last. I raised my hand to touch my face and felt only the cold, hard surface of porcelain or high-quality plastic. From inside the ballroom, faint but growing stronger, came the sound of whispers layering into a familiar chant. May the Force be with you. May the Force be with you. May the Force be with you. I turned away from my reflection and walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing strangely, as if the sound was being played back a fraction of a second after I made it. Behind me, I heard the ballroom doors open, followed by the soft whisper of fabric against the floor. The night air outside tasted metallic, heavy with chemical sweetness, and the scent of old paper and dust. In the parking lot, dozens of figures stood motionless among the cars, all wearing masks, all watching me with hollow attention. I got in my car and drove home, the radio playing static that occasionally resolved into whispered repetitions of familiar words. At red lights, I saw masked figures standing on street corners. In my rearview mirror, cars followed at the exact same distance, their drivers hidden behind smooth, reflective surfaces. At home, I avoided mirrors and tried to sleep, but the whispers continued, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the air itself. When I finally drifted off sometime near dawn, I dreamed of infinite corridors filled with infinite figures, all wearing the same face, all speaking the same words, all reaching for me with hands that had too many joints. I woke to sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows and the comforting sounds of a normal world outside. Traffic, birds, a neighbor's dog barking. The night seemed like a fever dream, the kind of vivid nightmare that feels completely real until daylight reveals its impossibility. But when I went to brush my teeth, the bathroom mirror showed only a smooth, featureless surface where my face should have been. And from somewhere deep in the house, carried on air currents I couldn't feel, came the faint whisper of familiar words. I haven't looked in a mirror since. I've learned to navigate by sound and touch, to live in a world where reflective surfaces might show me truths I'm not prepared to accept. Sometimes, in crowded places, I hear whispers that sound almost like blessing, almost like curse. Sometimes I feel eyes watching me with hollow attention, and sometimes late at night when sleep won't come, I wonder if I ever really left that ballroom at all. Story 12. The fluorescent lights above aisle 3 had been flickering for the past week, casting intermittent shadows that danced across the linoleum floor like restless spirits. I'd grown accustomed to the rhythm. 3 steady beats, then darkness, then the harsh white glare returning with the electric hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones. Tonight, though, something felt different about those shadows. They lingered too long in the corners, pooled too deep between the shelves. Working the graveyard shift at Murphy's Corner Market wasn't supposed to be eventful. Most nights, I'd see maybe a dozen customers, shift workers grabbing energy drinks, insomniacs buying ice cream, the occasional drunk stumbling in for cigarettes. The pay was decent enough for what it was, standing behind a register, restocking shelves, keeping an eye on the security monitors. Simple work for a simple life. But tonight, as I watched the clock crawl toward 3 a.m., the familiar weight of isolation felt heavier than usual. The air conditioning unit had been making strange noises all week, a low grinding sound that seemed to emanate from deep within the walls. Every few minutes, it would shudder and go silent, leaving behind an oppressive quiet that made my ears ring. The bell above the front door chimed at exactly 3:03 a.m. I glanced up from the magazine I'd been pretending to read and saw him, a tall, gaunt figure silhouetted against the streetlights outside. He moved with deliberate slowness, his footsteps echoing hollowly on the worn tiles. The fluorescent light in aisle 3 chose that moment to flicker again, and in the strobing illumination, I caught glimpses of his face, pale, angular, with deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. He made his way directly to the refrigerated section along the back wall, never once looking in my direction. I couldn't shake the feeling that his arrival wasn't coincidental, that he'd been waiting outside, watching, timing his entrance to that precise moment. The thought sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine, and I found myself gripping the edge of the counter tighter than necessary. The customer spent an unusually long time at the refrigerator, standing motionless before the dairy section. From where I sat, I could see his breath fogging the glass doors despite the warmth of the store. When he finally began moving again, it was with mechanical precision. He opened the mayonnaise section and began removing jars systematically, counting under his breath in a whispered cadence I couldn't quite make out. 40 jars. Exactly 40. He arranged them in his cart with obsessive care, ensuring each one faced the same direction, labels aligned perfectly. The sight struck me as profoundly wrong somehow, though I couldn't articulate why. Who buys 40 jars of mayonnaise at 3 in the morning? The practical part of my mind suggested catering, a restaurant supply run, but something deeper and more primitive whispered warnings I couldn't ignore. When he approached the counter, I noticed his hands first. Long, pale fingers that moved with surgical precision as he began unloading the jars. His skin had an odd, waxy quality, almost translucent under the harsh store lighting. He worked in complete silence, his movements creating a rhythmic percussion against the conveyor belt. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The transaction itself was surreal. He produced no wallet, no credit card, no bills. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a handful of coins, quarters, dimes, nickels, that he placed on the counter with meticulous care. As soon as the metal touched the surface, I felt the cold. Not just cool, but freezing, as if each coin had been stored in a freezer for hours. Ice crystals had formed on their surfaces, creating delicate patterns that caught the light like tiny prisms. Steam rose from where they contacted the relatively warm counter, creating miniature clouds that dissipated into the recycled air. The customer watched this process with apparent fascination, his head tilted slightly to one side like a bird observing something curious. I counted the money with numb fingertips, the cold seeping through my skin and spreading up my arms. The exact amount, down to the penny. When I looked up to hand him his receipt, those dark eyes met mine for the first time, and I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. They weren't just dark. They were empty, like looking into deep water at night. For a moment that stretched far too long, neither of us moved. Then he smiled, a thin expression that never reached those hollow eyes, and walked away. The bell chimed again as he left, but I didn't see him load the cart into a vehicle. By the time I managed to shake off the strange paralysis that had gripped me and look outside, he was gone. Only the 40 jars remained as evidence of his visit, along with the coins still glistening with melting ice on my counter. The rest of my shift passed in a haze of unease. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more pronounced. The air conditioning continued its irregular grinding, punctuated now by what sounded almost like whispers emanating from the vents. I found myself checking the security monitors more frequently, scanning the empty aisles for movement that never came. Around 5 a.m., as dawn began to creep through the windows, I decided to check our inventory. The customer had purchased every jar of mayonnaise we had in stock, cleaning out the entire section. That struck me as odd. We typically kept around 50 jars on hand, but he'd only bought 40. I made my way to the storage room to count what remained. The storage room felt different as I stepped inside. Colder, the fluorescent bulb overhead cast harsh shadows between the shelving units, creating a maze of light and darkness that seemed to shift as I moved. I found our backup mayonnaise supply easily enough, exactly 10 jars, which confirmed my count. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. The walk-in cooler door stood slightly ajar. That was impossible. Company policy required it to be sealed shut at all times when not in active use. I'd checked it myself at the beginning of my shift, ensuring the heavy door was properly closed. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the handle, metal cold enough to sting even through my palm. The cooler was empty, not just of mayonnaise, of everything. The shelves that should have held dairy products, prepared foods, and perishables stood bare. But that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. It was what occupied the space instead. 40 glass jars lined the floor in perfect rows, exactly as they'd been arranged in the customer's cart. Each one was full, but not with the creamy white condiment I expected. Instead, they contained small figures, no larger than my thumb, carved from what appeared to be white fat or rendered lard. The detail was extraordinary and deeply unsettling. Each figure was unmistakably human in form, and as I crouched for a closer look, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The faces were mine. Not similar, not reminiscent, identical. Every line, every feature, every imperfection I saw in mirrors was reproduced in miniature, with impossible accuracy. The figures stood pressed against the glass, tiny hands raised to the lids, apparently attempting to push them open from the inside. I stumbled backward, knocking into the doorframe hard enough to bruise my shoulder. The pain was sharp and immediate, a welcome anchor to reality that helped clear the fog of disbelief clouding my thoughts. This couldn't be real, couldn't be possible. People don't carve perfect miniature duplicates of strangers in the span of a few hours. Fat doesn't hold such fine detail, and it certainly doesn't move on its own. But as I watched, frozen in the doorway, one of the figures seemed to turn its tiny head toward me. Its mouth opened in what might have been a silent scream, or perhaps just the natural result of pressure against the glass. The other figures began moving then, subtle shifts, minute changes in position that could have been tricks of light and shadow, or something far more disturbing. I slammed the cooler door shut and fled. The remainder of my shift blurred together in a kaleidoscope of paranoia and mounting dread. Every customer who entered seemed to watch me with unusual intensity. The coins from the strange transaction had left permanent water stains on my counter, despite my repeated attempts to clean them, and the whispers from the air conditioning vents had grown more distinct, more organized, as if multiple voices were attempting to coordinate some invisible effort. When my replacement arrived at 7 a.m., I was already gathering my things. The day shift worker, a middle-aged woman who'd been with the company for years, commented on how pale I looked, asked if I was feeling well. I managed some non-committal response about not sleeping well, but her concerned expression suggested my explanation was unconvincing. As I prepared to leave, she mentioned something that stopped me cold. She'd noticed, she said, that we seemed to be completely out of mayonnaise. The dairy delivery wasn't scheduled until Thursday, which meant we'd be out of stock for 3 days. Had there been a run on mayonnaise the night before? Some kind of promotion I'd forgotten to mention? I stared at her, mouth dry, unable to form a coherent response, because I remembered now. I'd checked that cooler at the beginning of my shift. It had been full then, completely stocked with everything we needed for the week ahead, including at least 40 jars of mayonnaise that had simply vanished sometime between midnight and dawn. Driving home through the early morning streets, I found myself checking the rearview mirror obsessively. Not for cars, There was virtually no traffic at this hour, but for something else. Some sign that I was being followed, observed, studied by forces I couldn't begin to understand. The rational part of my mind insisted I was experiencing some kind of breakdown, that stress and sleep deprivation had finally caught up with me. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and the taste of metal seemed permanently lodged in my mouth. At home I attempted to sleep, but found rest impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those tiny faces pressed against glass, perfect replicas of my own features arranged in neat rows like some grotesque assembly line. The image was so vivid, so precise in its details, that I began to question whether it had been real at all. Human memory was fallible, susceptible to suggestion and distortion. Perhaps the stress of working alone during those dark hours had created something that never existed. But the cold of those coins had been real. The empty shelves had been real. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that the figures were still there, still waiting, still trying to push their way out of their glass prisons. I returned to work the following night with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. The store felt different somehow, smaller, more claustrophobic, as if the walls had moved incrementally closer during my absence. The fluorescent light in aisle 3 had been replaced, casting steady, unforgiving illumination that eliminated the comforting shadows I'd grown accustomed to. Throughout my shift, I avoided the storage room entirely, but as the hours crawled by, the temptation grew stronger. By 3 a.m., that significant hour when everything had begun, I could resist no longer. My legs carried me to the back of the store almost against my will, drawn by some invisible thread I couldn't snap. The walk-in cooler was fully stocked again, exactly as it should be. Dairy products, prepared foods, and fresh items arranged with corporate precision. No mysterious jars, no tiny figures, no evidence that anything unusual had ever occurred. I stood there for long minutes, breathing in the cold air and wondering if I was losing my mind. But as I turned to leave, something glinted in my peripheral vision. There, tucked behind a stack of yogurt containers, was a single jar of mayonnaise. Not one of ours. The label was different, older, with text I couldn't quite read in the dim light. And inside, barely visible through the white contents, was the faint outline of something that might have been a face. I left the jar where it was and walked away, but I could feel it there behind me like a weight pressing against my back. For the rest of my shift, I found myself glancing toward the storage room, half expecting to see that pale customer emerge from the shadows, with his empty eyes and mechanical smile. He never returned, but I know he's still out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment, the right combination of circumstances. And sometimes, during those quiet hours when the store feels most isolated from the rest of the world, I wonder if those tiny figures are still trying to push their way out, still pressing their minute hands against the glass, their mouths open in silent pleas for freedom I pray I'll never understand. The worst part isn't the uncertainty. It's the growing suspicion that they're not trying to escape at all. They're trying to tell me something, something important, something I'm not ready to hear. But every night at 3:03 a.m., I listen anyway. Story 13. The sawdust smell hit me first, that ancient resinous scent that crawls into your nostrils and refuses to leave. It clung to everything in our garage that morning, despite the fact that we hadn't done any woodwork in years. Mom was already arranging items on folding tables. Her garage sale spread across our driveway like the remnants of a life half-lived. I should have paid attention to that smell, should have recognized it as a warning. The old woman appeared around 9, shuffling between the tables with the deliberate movement of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Her fingers, gnarled like old roots, touched everything. The chipped ceramic bowls, Dad's old tools, Mom's collection of romance novels with their spine-cracked spines. But she didn't seem interested in purchasing anything. Instead, she kept asking the same question, her voice a papery whisper that seemed to scrape against the morning air. "How much for this one, dear?" And when Mom quoted any price, 50 cents, $1, even a quarter, the woman would shake her head sadly and move on to the next item. This pattern continued for nearly an hour, her weathered hands exploring our discarded possessions, while I pretended to organize boxes near the garage entrance. Something about her presence made my skin crawl, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the way she never quite looked directly at anything. Her pale eyes always focused slightly to the left or right of whatever she was examining. Mom, ever the optimist, eventually approached the woman with a concerned expression. "Is there anything you're particularly looking for? Maybe we can work something out." The old woman's head snapped up then, and for the first time, her eyes met mine directly. They were the color of dirty ice, and in them I saw something that made my stomach clench. A recognition that shouldn't have been possible. We'd never met, I was certain of that. But her gaze held the weight of familiarity, as if she'd been watching me for far longer than the past hour. "Everything should be free," she said, her voice gaining strength. "When you're giving away pieces of yourself, money becomes meaningless." Mom laughed nervously, the way she did when conversations took unexpected turns. "Well, I suppose we could negotiate on some items," but the woman was already walking away, her attention apparently lost. She moved toward the end of our driveway with that same measured pace, and I thought she was leaving. Relief began to unknot the tension in my shoulders. Then she stopped beside our mailbox and set down something I hadn't noticed her carrying. A medium-sized red suitcase, its leather surface cracked and faded like dried blood. "A gift," she called back to us, though she was already disappearing around the corner. "For the hospitality." Mom and I stared at the suitcase for several long moments. The morning sun seemed to dim as clouds gathered overhead, casting shifting shadows across our driveway. The sawdust smell grew stronger. "Should we?" Mom started, then trailed off. I found myself walking toward the suitcase without conscious decision. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself was thickening. The red leather was warm to the touch despite the cool morning, and the metal clasps were tarnished black with age. My fingers hesitated over the latches. "Maybe we should just leave it," Mom said from behind me, her voice tight with sudden apprehension. But curiosity won, as it always does in moments like these. The clasps opened with a sound like grinding teeth, and the lid fell back to reveal contents that made no immediate sense. Screwdrivers. Dozens of them. Their metal shafts twisted into perfect spirals, as if they'd been heated and carefully coiled by some impossible force. They gleamed despite their obvious age, arranged in neat rows like surgical instruments. Beneath them, a collection of photographs, their edges yellowed and brittle. I picked up the first photo with trembling fingers. It showed our house, unmistakably our house. But wrong, the image captured our property from the street view. But instead of the familiar two-story structure I'd lived in my entire life, the lot was empty. Raw earth, freshly cleared. A for sale sign planted in soil that looked recently turned. The timestamp in the corner read 1987. Our house had been built in 1983. I flipped through the remaining photos with increasing urgency. All of them showed the same impossible scene. Our address, our distinctive oak tree in the front yard, our specific lot configuration, but captured before any construction had begun. Some photos showed surveyor's stakes driven into the ground. Others captured the foundation being poured. A few showed the frame going up, skeletal and raw against an overcast sky. The final photograph made my hands shake. It showed a man standing beside the foundation, his back to the camera, wearing clothes I recognized from my father's old photo albums. The same jacket, the same posture, the same way of standing with one shoulder slightly higher than the other. But the man in the photo looked exactly like me. "What's in there?" Mom called, her voice seeming to come from very far away. I closed the suitcase without answering, my mind struggling to process what I'd seen. The photos had to be doctored somehow, elaborate fakes designed to unsettle us for reasons I couldn't comprehend. But the paper felt authentically aged, and the images showed details about our property that would have required extensive research to fake convincingly. We brought the suitcase inside and set it in the hallway closet, neither of us speaking about its contents for the rest of the day. But that night, lying in my bed, I could smell the sawdust seeping under my door. The scent was stronger now, mixed with something else. something metallic and sharp that reminded me of old tools left too long in damp places. I woke at dawn to find the suitcase sitting at the foot of my bed. The hallway closet was empty, its door hanging open like an accusation. I checked the latches on the suitcase. Still secure, still locked. But the leather was damp with something that looked like water but smelled like wood shavings. Droplets of the stuff had pooled on my hardwood floor, staining the finish in perfect circles. Mom insisted she hadn't moved it. Her confusion seemed genuine, tinged with the kind of bewilderment that comes from confronting something that defies logical explanation. We returned the suitcase to the closet, this time wedging it behind a stack of winter coats. I spent the day trying to convince myself it had been sleepwalking, or some kind of stress-induced hallucination brought on by the bizarre encounter with the old woman. But dawn came again, and so did the suitcase. This time it sat on my desk chair, positioned so it faced my bed directly. The sawdust smell was overwhelming now, thick enough that I could taste it on my tongue, sweet and cloying with undertones of decay. The droplets had multiplied, forming small puddles that reflected the early morning light like tiny mirrors. I opened the suitcase again, compelled by a need I couldn't name. The spiraled screwdrivers were exactly as I'd left them, but the photographs had changed. New images had appeared, or perhaps I simply hadn't noticed them before. These showed the interior of our house during construction, capturing rooms I knew intimately but rendered strange by their unfinished state. Exposed studs, rough electrical work, subflooring covered in dust and debris. In one photo, a figure stood in what would become my bedroom. The image was slightly blurred, as if the person had been moving when the picture was taken, but the silhouette was unmistakably human, and positioned exactly where my bed now stood. Over the following nights, the pattern continued. Each dawn brought the suitcase closer, despite increasingly elaborate attempts to secure it. We tried locking it in the basement. We found it in the hallway outside my room. We put it in Mom's car and drove it to a storage unit across town. It appeared on my nightstand the next morning, the sawdust stains now spreading across the surface like a slow infection. The smell was changing too, becoming more complex. Beneath the sawdust, I detected notes of fresh earth, concrete dust, and something organic, like leaves decomposing in wet soil. It clung to my clothes, my hair, my skin. Showers provided only temporary relief before the scent seeped back into my pores as if it were emerging from inside my body. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear sounds that shouldn't exist. The distant whine of power tools, the rhythmic hammering of construction work, the low rumble of heavy machinery. The sound seemed to come from within the walls themselves, as if our house was being built around me, while I lay motionless in my bed. During one particularly sleepless night, I found myself studying the spiraled screwdrivers more closely. The metal was warm to the touch and hummed faintly when I held them, like tuning forks struck too softly to hear but strong enough to feel. Each tool was twisted with perfect precision, the spirals so mathematically exact they seemed to follow some hidden geometric pattern. As I traced the coils with my fingertip, images flashed through my mind, brief, disjointed glimpses of our house in various stages of construction. But these weren't memories or even photographs. They felt more immediate, more real, as if I were experiencing them directly. I saw my bedroom taking shape around me, walls rising from the foundation like time-lapse footage. I felt sawdust raining down from ceiling joists that materialized above my head. I smelled the sharp tang of fresh paint mixing with wood preservative and concrete sealer. In these visions, I was always present, sometimes as an observer standing in partially framed rooms, sometimes as an active participant whose hands guided the construction. I watched myself measuring wall studs, installing electrical boxes, laying subflooring with the methodical precision of someone who'd done the work 1,000 times before. But these weren't skills I possessed. I'd never worked construction, never built anything more complex than a bookshelf from a kit. The photographs in the suitcase continued to evolve, new images appearing with each dawn migration. They began documenting not just the construction of our house, but the lives of its future inhabitants. I saw myself at various ages, as a child playing in rooms that wouldn't exist for years, As a teenager studying at a desk that hadn't been built yet. As an adult standing in my current bedroom looking exactly as I did now. The timestamps on these photos spanned decades, but the quality never degraded, the colors never faded. One morning I discovered a photo that stopped my breath entirely. It showed the old woman from the garage sale, standing in our front yard with a red suitcase in her hand. But the timestamp placed the image 30 years in the future. In the photo, she looked exactly as she had during her visit. The same weathered face, the same pale eyes, the same bent posture. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression I could only describe as patient. Behind her, our house was different. Older. The paint was peeling, the windows were boarded up, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds that seemed to move despite the apparent stillness of the photograph. But most disturbing was the figure visible in my bedroom window, a silhouette that could have been me, watching the old woman with the same patient expression she wore. I began to suspect that the suitcase wasn't just appearing in my room, it was calling me to it. During the day, I found myself drawn to wherever we'd hidden it last, my feet carrying me there without conscious direction. At night, I would wake to find myself standing beside it, my hand resting on the warm leather surface as if I'd been there for hours. The boundary between sleeping and waking began to blur. I would find myself in dreams that felt more real than reality, walking through versions of our house that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. I saw rooms under construction overlapping with their finished counterparts, watched walls phase in and out of existence like ghosts. The old woman was always there, moving through these temporal layers with casual familiarity, her red suitcase trailing behind her like a faithful pet. In one particularly vivid episode, I found myself standing in my bedroom during its initial construction. The walls were half-framed, and I could see through the gaps into other rooms that flickered between past and present states. The old woman stood beside the foundation, watching workers pour concrete that somehow flowed upward instead of settling. When she noticed my presence, she smiled with recognition. "Time is more flexible than people assume," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the noise of impossible construction, especially in places where it's been disturbed. I tried to ask what she meant, but found I couldn't speak. She continued as if she'd heard my unvoiced question. Some locations exist in multiple moments simultaneously. They become unstuck, experiencing all their potential histories at once. This house is one such place. She gestured toward the workers, and I realized they were building and demolishing simultaneously, raising walls while tearing them down, installing fixtures while removing them, creating and destroying in an endless loop. "You've been here all along," she said. "Every moment of this house's existence, past and future. The suitcase simply helps you remember." I woke, or thought I woke, to find the suitcase open on my bed, the spiraled screwdrivers arranged in a perfect circle around me. Sawdust covered every surface of my room, so thick it appeared to be falling like snow. But when I blinked, everything was normal again. Clean floors, closed suitcase, no trace of the construction debris. The line between hallucination and reality had become meaningless. I could no longer trust my senses, couldn't distinguish between what was happening and what I was imagining. The sawdust smell had become part of my identity, so thoroughly absorbed into my being that I wondered if I was becoming something else, something that belonged to the house rather than lived in it. On what I've decided to count as the 7th morning, I found the suitcase in my hands when I woke. I was standing in the center of my room, holding it as if I'd been preparing to leave. The leather was no longer warm. It was hot, almost burning, and the sawdust that dripped from its seams moved with purposeful direction, flowing toward the walls like water seeking the lowest point. I opened the suitcase one final time. The screwdrivers were gone, replaced by a single photograph that showed our house as it would appear long after I was gone. The structure was ancient, weathered beyond recognition, but somehow still inhabited. Lights glowed in windows that should have been dark, and smoke rose from a chimney that didn't exist in our current timeline. Standing in the front yard, watching this future version of our home, was the old woman, and beside her, holding an identical red suitcase, was myself, but older, changed, wearing the same patient expression she'd shown during her visit. In the photo, I was looking directly at the camera with eyes the color of dirty ice. As I write this, the sawdust continues to fall. It's covering my hands, my keyboard, the words themselves as they appear on the screen. I can feel it in my lungs, taste it on my tongue, smell it seeping from my pores. The boundary between myself and the house continues to dissolve, and I'm no longer certain which one of us is real. The suitcase sits open beside me, waiting. I understand now that it was never about the old woman's visit, or the impossible photographs, or the spiraled screwdrivers. It was about recognition. The moment when you realize you've been looking at yourself from the outside, when the observer and the observed collapse into a single point of existence. Tomorrow morning, someone will find this account, and a red suitcase filled with spiraled screwdrivers and photographs that shouldn't exist. They'll struggle to understand what happened, to separate reality from delusion, to determine whether any of this was real. They won't succeed. They're not supposed to. Time is more flexible than people assume. And some houses remember everything that's ever happened within their walls. Past, present, and future, all existing simultaneously in the space between heartbeats. The sawdust is falling faster now. Soon, I'll disappear beneath it completely, becoming part of the house's memory. And sometime in the future, during another garage sale in another timeline, an old woman will leave behind a red suitcase containing pieces of a story that hasn't finished telling itself. The construction never ends. It only changes who's holding the tools. Story 14. The cigarette burned down to my knuckles before I noticed the figure crossing my backyard. 2 o'clock in the morning, and there I was again on the deck, wrapped in the same threadbare robe I'd been wearing for 3 days straight. Sleep had become a stranger since the divorce papers arrived, since the house had started feeling like a mausoleum of failed dreams. The nicotine helped quiet the voices in my head, not literal voices, just the endless loop of recriminations and what-ifs that had taken residence behind my eyes. The fog had rolled in thick from the valley, turning my modest property into something primordial and unknowable. Streetlights became distant stars, and the familiar oak tree at the property line dissolved into a shapeless shadow. I'd grown accustomed to the eerie quiet that settled over the neighborhood after midnight, broken only by the occasional distant rumble of freight trains or the hollow cry of night birds. But tonight was different. The figure moved with purpose through the white curtain of mist, his silhouette sharp against the ethereal backdrop. Military posture, ramrod straight, each step measured and deliberate. Even through the fog, I could make out the crisp lines of a uniform, though what branch or era, I couldn't tell from my perch 15 feet above the yard. My first instinct was to call out, to demand an explanation for this trespass. The words formed in my throat but never made it past my lips. Something about the figure's movement, the unnatural steadiness of his gait through terrain he couldn't possibly see clearly, froze the challenge before it could emerge. He paused directly below the deck. In the pale wash of fog, his face tilted upward toward me, though the mist made his features indistinguishable. I felt his gaze nonetheless, felt it with the same certainty I felt the October chill seeping through my robe. The sensation crawled across my skin like ice water, raising goosebumps along my arms and sending an involuntary shiver down my spine. Then he spoke, his voice carrying with impossible clarity through the dampened air. "Congratulations on your last day." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not their content, though that was disturbing enough, but their tone. Respectful, almost ceremonial, delivered with the gravity of a military commendation, as if he were presenting me with a medal rather than what sounded distinctly like a death sentence. I opened my mouth to respond, to demand clarification, but when I looked down again, the yard was empty. The fog continued its lazy dance around the oak tree, undisturbed by any presence. No footsteps, no rustle of leaves, no indication that anyone had been there at all. My cigarette had burned down to nothing, the filter hot against my fingers. I dropped it into the coffee can I kept for butts and fumbled for another. my hands shaking as I worked the lighter. 3 attempts before the flame caught, illuminating my trembling fingers in brief orange relief. I told myself it had been a dream, or the tail end of one. I'd been known to doze off in the deck chair, especially during these late-night vigils. The mind played tricks during the liminal hours between night and dawn, particularly when stress and insomnia had worn the edges of perception thin. The rational explanation sat comfortably in my consciousness, a warm blanket against the chill of what I'd experienced. But rationality couldn't explain the taste of copper that had flooded my mouth when the figure spoke, or the way my chest had tightened as if something vital had been extracted from inside my ribcage. I remained on the deck until sunrise, chain smoking and watching the fog gradually surrender to pale morning light. The yard revealed itself inch by inch, returning to its familiar mundane geography. The oak tree, the vegetable garden I'd abandoned midsummer, the rusted barbecue grill, all exactly as they should be. When I finally went inside, my legs felt disconnected from my body, as if I were learning to walk on stilts. The house, too, seemed altered somehow, not in any way I could articulate. The furniture remained in place. The walls held their same coat of off-white paint. The hardwood floors bore the same scratches and stains they'd accumulated over 15 years of occupancy. Yet something fundamental had shifted, like a picture hanging slightly askew. I made coffee with hands that still carried a tremor, though whether from caffeine withdrawal or lingering unease, I couldn't say. The morning routine, shower, coffee, checking email on my laptop, felt like play acting, as if I were performing the role of a normal person going through normal motions, while something vast and incomprehensible moved in my peripheral vision. The first sign came when I stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper. Footprints, muddy impressions pressed deep into the flower bed beneath the deck, leading in a straight line from the oak tree to the side of the house. Military boots by the look of them, thick-soled and substantial, with a distinctive tread pattern that had left clear impressions in the soft earth. My rational mind immediately began constructing explanations. A neighbor's dog walker cutting through my yard, a delivery person taking a shortcut, someone checking meter readings. All perfectly reasonable scenarios that could account for the tracks, except the prints didn't deviate or wander the way a lost person's might. They followed a direct path with mathematical precision, as if the walker had known exactly where he was going despite the fog. And they were deep, pressed into the earth with more weight than seemed possible for a normal person walking across relatively level ground. I followed the trail along the side of the house, past the kitchen window and the defunct air conditioning unit, until they stopped at the basement door. The old wooden entrance I'd painted green 3 summers ago, then forgotten about entirely. I'd been meaning to replace the rotted frame for years, but like so many home improvement projects, it had fallen victim to procrastination and more pressing concerns. The door stood slightly ajar. I was certain I'd left it locked. The basement contained nothing of value, just Christmas decorations, old paint cans, and boxes of papers I'd been meaning to sort through for the better part of a decade. But I was meticulous about security, especially since living alone. Every door, every window, checked twice before bed. The hinges protested with a dry squeal as I pulled the door open wider. Basement air rushed out to greet me, cold, stale, tinged with the musty sweetness of old cardboard and forgotten storage. The wooden steps descended into darkness, and I realized I'd never bothered to install proper lighting down there. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, operated by a pull chain somewhere in the depths of the cellar. I should have retrieved a flashlight from the kitchen, should have approached this methodically and safely. Instead, I found myself descending the creaking stairs, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall for guidance. The temperature dropped noticeably with each step, and by the time I reached the concrete floor, my breath was forming small puffs in the frigid air. The pull chain for the light proved maddeningly elusive in the darkness. I waved my hand overhead in increasingly frantic sweeps until finally my knuckles connected with the thin metal links. The bulb flickered to life with a tired buzz, casting harsh shadows that seemed to writhe and shift in the unstable illumination. The basement was exactly as I remembered it. Concrete walls stained with decades of moisture, exposed floor joists overhead, and cardboard boxes stacked against every available surface. My ex-wife's winter coat still hung from a makeshift closet rod, and the artificial Christmas tree leaned against the far wall like a skeletal scarecrow. But there, on the workbench beneath the single window, sat something that had definitely not been there before. A small wooden box, dark with age, its brass hinges green with verdigris. The wood bore the scratches and dents of extensive handling, and when I approached I could smell the distinctive aroma of old leather and metal polish. Military surplus, unmistakably. The kind of container that might once have held a soldier's personal effects or important documents. My hands moved independently of my conscious will, lifting the lid with the careful reverence one might reserve for handling ancient artifacts. The hinges protested with a soft groan, and the smell of old leather intensified. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay 3 military medals, campaign ribbons by the look of them, each one bearing the distinctive design elements of World War I commemoratives. Bronze stars suspended from striped silk ribbons, the metal dulled with age but still clearly bearing their original engravings. Victory medals, perhaps, or service decorations from the Western Front. I lifted the first medal from its velvet bed, turning it toward the weak light of the basement bulb. The reverse side bore an inscription, etched in the precise block letters favored by military engravers. My name. My full legal name, exactly as it appeared on my driver's license and divorce papers. The metal grew cold in my palm, cold enough that I nearly dropped it back into the box. But fascination overrode discomfort, and I examined the other 2 decorations. Each bore the same inscription, the same impossible engraving of a name that belonged to someone born 70 years after the armistice that ended the Great War. The rational explanations came more slowly this time, each one feeling forced and inadequate even as I constructed it. Coincidence of names. A practical joke orchestrated by someone with access to military surplus and engraving equipment. An elaborate prank designed to unnerve me during an already difficult period in my life. But who would go to such lengths? And how would they have known about my midnight deck visits? My recent habit of smoking alone in the small hours when sleep proved elusive. I closed the box carefully and carried it upstairs, setting it on the kitchen counter where the morning light could better illuminate its contents. Under the brighter illumination, the metals looked even more authentic. The weight and feel of genuine bronze, the craftsmanship of wartime manufacturing, the proper aging that couldn't be easily faked. The house felt different now, charged with a tension I couldn't identify or dispel. Every creak of the settling foundation, every whisper of wind through the eaves, seemed pregnant with significance. I found myself listening for footsteps, for voices, for any sound that might signal the return of my nocturnal visitor. Over the following days, the sensation intensified. I began to notice things I'd previously overlooked, shadows that seemed to move independently of their casting objects, peripheral flickers that vanished when I turned my head, the persistent feeling of being observed even when I was certain I was alone. The house, which had been my refuge during the chaos of divorce proceedings, began to feel like a stage set where I was unknowingly performing for an invisible audience. Sleep became increasingly elusive. When I did manage to doze, my dreams were filled with images of muddy trenches and gas attacks, of men in uniform moving through no man's land under a pewter sky. I would wake with the taste of sulfur in my mouth and the sound of distant artillery fire echoing in my ears, though the neighborhood remained as quiet as ever. The metals drew me back repeatedly. I found myself examining them at odd hours, turning them over in my hands and studying every detail of their construction. The engravings never changed, never revealed themselves to be the product of modern fabrication. They remained stubbornly authentic, impossibly personal, and utterly unexplainable. I researched military records, thinking perhaps there had been another person with my name who had served in the First World War. The internet yielded nothing. Census records, draft registrations, casualty lists. No trace of anyone bearing my name who had lived during that era. It was as if the medals commemorated service that had never occurred, honoring a phantom soldier who existed only in brass and bronze. The paranoia began as a whisper, but grew to a roar. I installed additional locks on all the doors and windows, then found myself checking them obsessively throughout the day. I purchased a security camera system and spent hours reviewing footage that showed nothing more threatening than neighborhood cats and the occasional delivery truck. The rational part of my mind recognized the symptoms of stress-induced anxiety, but rationality had become a thin voice, drowned out by the growing certainty that something fundamental had changed in my world. The worst part was the anticipation. Every evening, as darkness approached, I felt the pull of the deck, the compulsion to resume my vigil in the night air. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that whatever I'd experienced had been a one-time event, probably explicable by fatigue and stress. But as the sun set, and the familiar fog began to gather in the valley, I found myself reaching for my cigarettes and heading for the door. The second encounter came exactly 1 week after the first. Same time, same circumstances. Me on the deck. Cigarette burning forgotten between my fingers. Fog thick enough to muffle sound and obscure vision. But this time, I was watching for him. This time, I was ready. He emerged from the mist like a photograph developing in a dark room, his figure gradually gaining definition and substance, until he stood once again in my backyard. The military bearing was unchanged, as was the crisp perfection of his uniform, though in the improved lighting I could make out more details. World War I issue, definitely. Puttees wrapped around his legs, the distinctive Brodie helmet of the American Expeditionary Forces, campaign ribbons adorning his chest. He looked up at me again, his face still obscured by shadow and fog, and spoke with the same impossible clarity. The time grows short. Have you prepared yourself? This time I managed to find my voice. The words came out as a croak, barely audible even to myself. Prepared for what? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved closer to the house, close enough that I could see the mud caked on his boots, the water stains on his woolen uniform. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of gentle reproach, as if he were addressing a child who had failed to complete an assigned task. The end of days carries weight, soldier. The crossing requires proper documentation. Then he was gone again, vanishing between one heartbeat and the next, leaving only the fog and the growing certainty that my sanity was slipping away like water through cupped hands. But in the morning there were more footprints, fresh ones, leading once again to the basement door. And in the wooden box, 2 additional medals had appeared overnight. I didn't call the police. What would I tell them? That a dead soldier was visiting my backyard to deliver military decorations, that I was receiving posthumous awards for service in a war that ended before my grandfather was born? The very thought of trying to explain the situation to another human being highlighted its absurdity, its fundamental impossibility. Instead, I began to research the house itself, digging through property records and historical documents at the local library. The home was older than I'd realized, built in 1923 by a veteran named Garrison, who had used his military pension and a small inheritance to purchase the land. He'd lived there alone until his death in 1954, a bachelor who had never quite readjusted to civilian life after his service in France. But even that discovery failed to provide a satisfactory explanation. Garrison had been real, documented, his military service properly recorded and commemorated. He bore no resemblance to my nocturnal visitor, and his war had ended in 1918, not continued into some eternal present where medals could be awarded retroactively to men who had never served. The third visit came 3 nights later. This time the figure remained at the edge of the property, barely visible through the fog. But his voice carried clearly, delivered with the same ceremonial gravity. The final inventory has been completed. Your service record is now complete. When I descended to the basement the next morning, the wooden box contained a total of 12 medals, each one bearing my name, each one commemorating battles I had never fought in a war that had ended before I was born. I sit now on the deck as I write this, cigarette burning down to my knuckles, fog beginning to gather in the valley below. The rational explanations have all been exhausted, ground down by the relentless pressure of impossible evidence. The medals sit on the table beside me, their bronze surfaces cold to the touch despite the evening warmth. Tomorrow is Halloween, though I suspect the date is more significant than mere coincidence. The figure spoke of last days and final inventories, of crossing over and proper documentation. Perhaps he was never talking about death at all, but about something else entirely, a different kind of ending. a transition to a state of being where linear time becomes negotiable and service records can be amended retroactively. The fog is thicker tonight, and I can already see him moving through the white curtain of mist, approaching with that same measured military stride. But this time, he's not alone. Other figures move beside him, a small unit of soldiers emerging from whatever temporal displacement they've been trapped within. They're carrying something, a uniform, perfectly pressed and bearing the same campaign ribbons that fill the wooden box. It looks like it would fit me perfectly. I should be terrified. Perhaps I am, underneath the strange calm that has settled over me like fog. But terror seems inadequate to the situation, too small an emotion for whatever is unfolding in my backyard. What I feel instead is a kind of relief, the satisfaction of finally understanding a puzzle that has tormented me for weeks. I was never supposed to live this life, never meant to navigate the mundane complexities of marriage and divorce, mortgage payments and career advancement. Somehow, through some cosmic clerical error, I'd been assigned to the wrong existence, the wrong century, the wrong war. But the universe, it seems, is a meticulous accountant. Eventually all debts must be settled, all service records completed. The figures have stopped at the base of the deck, looking up at me with faces I still cannot clearly see. The cigarette burns forgotten in my hand as their leader speaks one final time. It's time to report for duty. I stand, my legs steady for the first time in weeks, and begin my descent into the fog.